Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. As you can tell, we have an enthusiastic crowd here tonight. The title of tonight's talk is Globalism, the Program. Now, we look around and we see all kinds of things going wrong. We see the Waco situation, the Oklahoma City bombing, Ruby Ridge. Are all of these connected? Are they all part of a well-laid-out program? Well, you're going to find out that answer tonight. Our speaker tonight spent 31 years in the Air Force, where he earned the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit 3 times. He was a distinguished graduate of the Air War College. He went on to research and development management, weapon systems concepts, guided weapons technology, target acquisition aids, focused energy weapons, operations research applications. He directed 1,200 personnel who developed the Maverick missile system, the optical laser and missile system, imaging infrared guidance system, precision location strike system, the fighter attack system, and a whole lot more. His resume goes on for several more pages. Tonight, he will tell us that in 1928, the communists wrote the program to bring in the New World Order, and he says they're following it step by step. By knowing where they have gone, and by looking ahead where they're going, we can see where we are today and what's coming. Will you help me welcome General Ben Parton?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. I know you may wonder why, as a retired Air Force general running around the United States talking about bombings and the Communist World Program. But in 1947, in the National Defense Act of 1947, when the Air Force was separated from the Army, all of the development capability for developing weapons for air delivery stayed in the Army. It did not go with the Air Force. So in the early 1950s, the Air Force decided they were going to get back in the weapons development business to exploit new technology and overcome a lot of major operational deficiencies. And they set up a program for bringing in a few graduate engineers into eight quarters of graduate work in armament engineering, and I was one of the first 6 of those people who were trained quite extensively in all the gory details of weapons and munitions and explosive training design and all the things that go with it. And I stayed with that work for quite some time. I flew 25 years in the Air Force, but most of my time in the Air Force was still in the research and development side of things. After I attended this 8 quarters of graduate work in armament engineering, they give you a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, but the breadth of the course was such that they could give you a master's in almost several other areas. After I finished that work, I went to the ballistic research laboratories at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Maryland, because at that time that was fairly much the mecca of the conventional non-nuclear weapons development area in the United States, excluding the chemical and biological. And I worked there for 2 years through several of the laboratories. Most of my time was in the terminal ballistics area, and I spent most of the time there developing the continuous rod warhead for the Beaumark missile. And the Beaumark, the continuous rod warhead, is probably one of the most difficult and most complex warheads in the non-nuclear area, and probably second only to the pit design in nuclear weapons. But this is a picture of a continuous rod warhead that was being tested out at China Lake. And you have a circle there about 150 feet across. Probably the radius is about 75 feet. And these panels around the periphery of that circle are sheet aluminum 4 feet by 8 feet. And you can see the panels all around the circle are being cut continuously around that circle about 150 feet in diameter. The warhead has already functioned in the center. That's about the extent of the expansion of the detonation products from the warhead. And because you had the warhead was surrounded by a heavy double layer of rods, metal rods, the detonation products went off to the end, the so-called end effect. But I bring this up to show you what a continuous rod warhead is, because it's very significant with respect to TW-800. Now, those rods, when the warhead goes off, you have an accordion expanding hoop or circle moving out 5,000 or 6,000 feet a second, cold rolled hard steel rods, but they're all welded at alternate ends so that you have an expanding, scissoring expansion of that circle, and it's continuous. And the most difficult thing is to design the warhead so it is continuous and has the proper velocity. Now, we had a shoot down of TW-800, and here's the results as shown in the where they assembled that aircraft back together in the hangar up on Long Island. And if you saw the continuous rod warhead, it would reach out pretty far. If you had an aircraft out there, instead of those aluminum sheets, it would have sliced an aircraft in two just as well as it would have those aluminum sheets. Now, it was announced that it could not have been a missile that brought down TW-800. Why? Because they recovered all 4 engines, and none of the 4 engines showed any missile damage. They had blinders on, only thinking about IR-guided small missiles, shoulder-fired, aircraft-fired, or some other IR-guided missile. Well, an IR-guided missile is no good for all-weather purposes. And if you have an aircraft going to attack a city with an atomic bomb or an aircraft carrier, and it's in the soup, and it has capability to deliver the weapon with the radar, IR missiles are no good to you. So we use this kind of warhead in many applications for surface-to-air missiles, because they have an all-weather capability. And if they're proximity fused, and they can reach out quite a distance, you can have considerable inaccuracy in that guidance system and still destroy the target if the warhead and fusing system is compatible with the reach of the warhead. And what you do is you have a fusing system, and is looking off at an angle, and when it intercepts the target, the missile fires, and the rods go out in an expanding hoop and slice across the aircraft just like a saber across the watermelon. Now, you could use a fragmenting warhead, what you call a blast frag warhead, and you send out, instead of sending everything in a strong, long, continuous cut, you send it out in fragments. You may punch a bunch of holes in something, and you'll destroy maybe some systems in the aircraft, but you're not going to get a catastrophic structural failure unless you hit the system. But with all-weather guidance systems, you have longer wavelengths. You're using semi-active or active radar, going after a beacon or transponder or a carrier wave, and you're dealing with longer wavelengths. You have a small aperture on the missile, so you have accuracy problems. And if you miss the aircraft 35 feet or 40 feet with that kind of warhead and with that reach and proximity fusing, you'll still slice it in two. So it doesn't matter. So if you look at the TW-800, across, you can see that from this point forward, and this is the forward end of the aircraft, you have a continuous cut from the top all the way down to the bottom. And this part of the aircraft was separated from this part at that point, and the nose of the aircraft went down integrally. It wasn't torn up at all. It went down in one piece, ballistically straight down. Now, at the time the warhead hit it, you had about 5 pounds of pressure for pressurization in the aircraft. So when the warhead hit it, and it cut it in two, you had instantly about 250,000 pounds pushing it apart because of the pressurization inside the aircraft. And it appears to me the first point of contact with the warhead was right here, and you can see the evident explosive decompression dropping the pressure very quickly from the first contact with the aircraft. But as big as the aircraft is, 747, it took considerably longer time for it to exhaust the gases out with the push going forward. Now, from this point back to this point, it looks to me like you had another continuous rod that hit the aircraft here, and it even went down into the wing. The ends of the pieces here you see are structural cuts from the recovery of the aircraft from the bottom. Now, from this point to this point, you can see a lot of discoloration and smoke and heat damage. But there's no severe fire damage because you can see that that dichromate paint is still yellow. There wasn't any burning. But when the nose came off, it probably pitched up a little, and the seats and things coming out, you can see the streaks across the aircraft from that damage. Now, from this point back, you had this part of the aircraft saw intense heat and flame. The paint is severely charred all along here. In here, you can see the aluminum skin is melted out between the ribs and the stringers. And so you had this part all in here was separated and came down in random parts spread all over a big area. But from here back, came down together. And probably the most qualified witness who observed what happened with TW-800. A guy by the name of Major Myers, National Guard pilot, he was in a helicopter, headed right straight out to it, looking at it and saw it, and he had a lot of experience in Vietnam. He saw many missiles going after and hitting aircraft. And he said he saw two bright white flashes. Two. Just a few milliseconds apart. And when they shot, and the Vincent shot down the Iranian aircraft in the Gulf War, what did they do? Fired two missiles. 007 was shot down by the Russians. What did they do? Fired two missiles, air-to-air. And it's standard procedure. If you're going to bring down a target with very high probability, you fire two missiles, because you always are confronted with not only just inaccuracies, but you're confronted with reliability of the system. So it's normal to do that. And they were just a few milliseconds apart, those flashes. The first flash was clean and clear. The second flash grew into a fireball. And that tells me that the first one cut here. The angle is tilted a little up, and the cut was across the plane, tilted just a little bit. And it was a forward intercept, and the guidance law of the missile would make it converge on the trajectory of the aircraft. So the first one cut along this line, and the second one cut along this line, and it got right down through here, and it probably got into the wing tanks outboard of the fuselage, as well as to the main fuel tank under the fuselage. Well, this tank is usually empty, probably have 100 gallons in there of fuel that you can't purge, but you had, after it got burning well, you had a lot of fairly violent exhaust of gases from the burning as the aircraft was, the back part of the aircraft was going down. But all the section in here was probably torn up aerodynamically as it was coming down because of the big cut here, but you did not have the forces to pull it off clean like you had the forces to pull it off clean here. So it peeled off separately, and you can see it was scattered all over when you look at the pattern of the deployment of all the components from that aircraft. Now, if it was a surface-to-air missile, I got all the information I could on TW-800, as much of the witness information, and looked as much as I could, and I sent a fax to the chief investigator up in New York, and I said, looking at all the information, I can only come to one conclusion. The only thing that's totally consistent with all the information out there is that that aircraft was brought down by a continuous rod surface-to-air warhead, continuous rod warhead fired from a surface missile with proximity fusing. And if you don't have anybody who knows anything about the terminal ballistics of a continuous rod warhead damage to an aircraft, I'd be happy to come up and give you a hand. I did not get a response. I did not anticipate getting a response. Now, I was told within 24 hours by someone who was fairly well connected in some of the intelligence area that the aircraft they had been tracking a submarine from up around the St. Lawrence Seaway down the East Coast, and it was missing. They lost contact with it there in the New York Bay. Now, if it was a submarine that fired the missile, there are several countries that have sails. They have surface-to-air missiles in their sails. That is a part of the submarine that sticks up. We have none. In any of the American manufactured submarines, none of ours have missiles in the sail. The Soviet manufacturers, some of them do. Iraq has them. Iran has them. So I don't know whose submarine it was. Now, Pierre Salinger came out with a story. There was friendly fire, trying to blame it on the United States Navy. That story had been on the internet for many months before Pierre Salinger gave it some credibility. But the author, the editor and publisher of Soviet Analyst, probably one of the most brilliant men I know, tracking what's going on in the world today and from an intelligence point of view. He is also the editor of Golitsyn's book, Perestroika Deception. How many have read Perestroika Deception? Nobody? It's probably the most significant, one of the most significant books of the 1990s. A book he wrote earlier, New Lies for Old, back in the 1980s, was probably the most significant book of that decade if you're trying to understand what's going on in the world. And he devoted a whole issue to Flight TWA 800. And he said, do the American authorities know at the highest levels that TWA Flight 800 was destroyed by a missile or missiles launched from a submarine off Long Island, and are they preparing to cover up this act of war? That was his conclusion from, and he covers a tremendous amount of information in this newsletter. Was it an act of war? I don't know. But the point that he makes in here is immediately after TWA 800, within days, there was a G7+1 meeting already planned in Europe. And at that G7+1, which is the moneyed countries of the world plus Russia, the one is Russia, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. He said they turned that meeting into a counterterrorism meeting. And in that meeting, they agreed to have a free exchange among the G7+1 countries on all terrorist and counter-terrorist activities in all these countries. And he says it was well worth it to them to have gotten an opening, access to the files of the FBI and the CIA on all internal and external terrorist activities and information that they had, to have brought down that ship, to turn that meeting into that kind. Now, is that what happened? It's probably as consistent with everything that I know as anything. And I have found that Christopher's story is probably has some of the best connections in the intelligence world of anyone that I know. It's a most terribly regrettable thing, but after all these months, they have not come to a conclusion with respect to what caused that airplane to come down. And I was amazed to find out that Major Myers was not permitted by the FBI to testify to the National Transportation Board until, gosh, it must have been almost 6 months after the incident. Now, we've had another bombing, and most of you, I'm sure, do not know very much about, even know that we had a bombing in Waco. Now, this picture shows the compound as it was being, I dare say, attacked on the day that the whole compound was burned. You can see a tank entering the building here. This towering part of the building is over about a 20-foot by 20-foot reinforced concrete structure that they call the Church Records Vault. And you had a tower above that, three or four floors. And I want you to note this window right here. You have a flagpole, and the line of sight from the TV camera that took the pictures that I'll show you of the explosion was lined up across here, so you can precisely determine the line of sight from the camera back to the fire. And you have tanks in behind, a tank back here that had been driving into the building and collapsing the structures in the behind, and this channel across here finally tumbled down, and the walls were pushed in very much around the whole building. And then these two tanks finally pulled away, and just a few seconds after, a few minutes after they pulled away, the whole thing was engulfed with flame. It started right here and back in here. And with the very high winds, it was consumed fairly quickly. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see the arrow, you can see a bright spot, and that is right there. That is the window that I was pointing out to you, and you can even see the cross piece in there, because when that demolition charge went off in that building, the walls really provided tamping, and the force that they exert back on the expanding gases is very high, because the pressure is so moving so fast and the pressure is so high. It's like hitting a baseball with a bat. The faster you hit the ball, the greater the pressure on it, and the same thing is true in the tamping effect of a building surrounding detonation products. And the second frame shows it blasting through the window. The second frame shows it getting over to the corner, and the building comes apart, and you can see in all those pictures there the distortions and perturbations and the expansion of that gas cloud are caused by the dynamic flow of the gaseous products around the building components as it is blown up. And you can see here the further expansion of the fireball, and it starts to lift down here in this particular area. But that was a detonation of a demolition charge in the building. Now, if you look at the top, after the fire, you look at the top, and there is a hole, probably 2 feet across, and that's the kind of hole you get with a demolition charge. You have concrete in contact or close proximity to high explosives, and the pressure is several hundred times the yield strength of the concrete, so the concrete in the area of the hole there just turned to dust. And you have, of course, fairly high dynamic gas pressures going down into the bunker below. And the red flag in all these pictures will denote a burned or charred body, and there's a body, and you can see the ribs there. But down inside of the bunker, there were 28 women and children, and there is the bunker after the fire. The tank drove into the building and stayed for some time. It pushed, there's all the kitchen stuff. It went through 4 walls and a kitchen, and all that was pushed up against the building. You can see the coal-poured concrete lines in that picture, and they're all cracked from the pressure inside, all corners around the top and down the corners on the side, because when the gas pressure from that demolition charge went into the building, it tended to blow it up like a balloon. So all the external walls were in tension. This picture shows you the building, and the back side of it, you can see the little hairline cracks all up and down here and here. Now, it was reported that that explosion was a propane tank. That was what it was blamed on. But there's the propane tank. There's no damage to the propane tank. There were some pictures, reported pictures of it that showed this end blown off, but they were doctored pictures. But there's the propane tank. You see the tension cracks. You had the pressure inside the building. And I'm told by the investigators, the chief investigator for the case that's being tried, and I was asked to do this forensic. The only reason I got into it, I was asked to do this forensic, and I was provided all this material on it. I was told that the building, the tank, had never even been serviced. There had never been any propane at all. Now, it's obvious to me that the room inside the bunker had been prepped for this picture. You have all these guns stacked against the wall, but if you notice here, there's a gun against a gun and a gun against that gun, and there's about 3 or 4 guns together. Now, if you had the equivalent of 3 or 4 F-16 jet blasts down in here, I don't know how you burned those and left them stacked against the wall with the gas dynamic pressures and gas flow in there. Secondly, from the spall from the hole in the top or anywhere else, you'd never find it lined up around one wall and not around the other walls. It would be symmetric to the hole or something else. So the room was quite well prepared for that picture. So what happened down there at Waco? There are a lot of things and a lot of misinformation put out, and I just pointed out some of the things in misrepresenting the truth with respect to what happened at Waco. They went back in and they scraped down to get rid of all evidence. All the building there was crushed and hauled away and disposed of, and then they went back in sometime later and scraped about 8 inches of soil up to get rid of all further evidence. Now here's the Murrah building in Waco. This has been a great heartburn to most American citizens. And what happened in the demolition of the building or the destruction of the building at Waco, this column, and this column collapsed across the front, and one column back in the middle of the building. Back in the middle of the building. When I first saw and heard the evidence about the bombing in Oklahoma, and saw the pictures of what had happened, with my background, I knew somebody was lying and not telling the truth. And I stuck my nose into it because I felt somebody had to try to get to the bottom of the problem and expose the facts. And because of my background, I said, if not me, who, and if not now, when? So I went down to Senator Nichols' office and talked to his assistant who was handling things for him in Oklahoma, and I tried to get him to go to Oklahoma or get hold of the people in Oklahoma and get a separate and independent investigation of what happened in the building. He told me 2 days later that there was a big difference of opinion in Oklahoma with respect to what happened. I knew then he was going to do nothing, so I put together a technical report and analysis, my bomb damage assessment of the building, and I concluded there had to have been demolition charges in the building. The 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel all outside could not possibly have done the damage. And I sent that report to about 75 senators and congressmen. Now, the response back to me was minimal to almost a black hole. One senator wrote back and he said, I intend to withdraw my support, sponsorship of the anti-terrorism bill, and I will work to see that it is cleaned up. But what happened? The Senate and the House, they were crawling all over each other trying to ram that counterterrorism bill through, which would remove a lot of your constitutional guarantees. And the Senate rammed it through without going to a committee. And we got enough, I think, interest and concern on the part of the Senate and the House the House drug their feet, and it took them a year to pass the bill, and Congressman Barr from Georgia was very instrumental in getting a bunch of amendments through that took some of the worst parts out, but it still, in many respects, was a bad bill. I think the next chart here shows some sentiments that both you and I share to a certain extent, but it's something I'd like to point out. This is one of the rescue teams left a sign on the building across the street from the Murrah building, and they said, we search for the truth. We seek justice. The courts require it, the victims cry for it, and God demands it. There's just one thing I do not agree with, and that is that the courts require it. They haven't shown that to me at all. In fact, there's been too many problems with the courts. When I did that technical analysis, I started to mention, I hand-delivered 75 copies of that report to senators and congressmen, hoping to get some broader reaction, and nothing really happened. And then I had the opportunity to go to Oklahoma, but I want to point out here, the backside of that building, this is really the front of the building, and this is after the explosion. You can see how much of the building is still very much intact and not destroyed. And this picture shows you something I want you to... Did I skip one? No. I want to show you this picture, which shows the building as it was being imploded. Now, you see, they have all these little charges, probably around 200, 150, 200 charges, no more than a couple of 100 pounds of explosives, all over that building that were used to bring it down. But they were placed, they were drilled, holes were drilled into the concrete, and those explosives, high explosives, were inserted into those holes. Now, when the charges were set off, the area around the explosive, you had a wave of deformation sweeping from the explosive into the concrete. So an area around the concrete was turned into powder, a very fine powder. You're dealing with pressure several hundred times the yield strength of concrete, probably 300 pounds at least. And it's like taking a hammer and taking a grain of sand and putting it on an anvil and smashing it. What do you get left? Dust. And the same thing is true when you have a demolition charge in close proximity to concrete. As long as you're way above the compressive yield strength of the concrete, you're just going to turn it into dust. Now, there was a lot of compressive failure concrete in that building because they said it was everywhere. Even your people talking about one child was covered with it, laying there, and they couldn't even recognize the child because everything had a white blanket of dust on it, and because of the contact explosive kind of damage that you had in the building. Now, looking at the overhead of the Murrah building, on the back side, you see the asymmetry in the pattern of damage when those columns collapsed straight down across the front. Here is a tree straight out in front of the building in the parking lot, and it's probably a little closer from where the truck bomb was here to that tree than it was from the truck bomb to this building here. Now, this is a very flimsy, poor constructed building right beside of another building. This is a so-called Water Resources building, reinforced concrete columns, and it didn't have that much structural damage to it compared to the little red brick building there, because the red brick building should have never been standing there anyway, because it was very, very, very poorly constructed. Now, Charles Key was a member of the Oklahoma Assembly, and he had gotten the report I distributed to the Senate and the House, and he decided he was going to try to get an investigation underway by the General Assembly in Oklahoma. And he invited me down to give my presentation and my analysis of the failure of the building and how it was brought down to the members of the Oklahoma Assembly and surviving family members, plus the news media was there also. And we had a press conference on the subject. But the governor was vociferously opposed to having any kind of an investigation, and he put a lot of pressure on the House, and it didn't happen. So they did not get the investigation underway. But it was while I was down there on this visit, I went to some people and organizations there and had the opportunity to get hundreds and hundreds of pictures so that I could see what the evidence and destructive evidence throughout the cleanup process. If I'd gone in there right after the explosion, everything was covered up and you wouldn't have had access or been able to see an awful lot of things. So I was fortunate to be able to get lots and lots of pictures to confirm or deny or try to find out really what happened in the bombing in Oklahoma. Well, I came back and I did a more detailed and technical analysis of the bombing and put together a report, and my basic conclusions were this. If you take the 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate in fuel oil and put it in a sphere, you get something about that size, and if it's stuck out there out front where the crater was, actually, I'll show you another report in a few minutes. The crater's about 3 feet in this direction, a little further across and a little closer to that column. But my analysis said no place in that building should you have had compressive failure from explosives, nowhere, because the closest point of contact from this explosive charge here, by the time it touched that column, from where you had about 500,000 pounds per square inch here, by the time it got to that closest column, you were down to something on the order of 375 pounds. The compressive strength of concrete is up 4,000, 5,000 pounds. So nowhere in the building should you have seen compressed fail concrete from explosive. Now when you drop, the red columns all came down. And these were the red ones I showed you across the front. The small columns just come down to that big transfer beam across at the 3rd floor. And what you had when the columns the bottoms was cut out in the front, it dropped, and you had a hinge line where they broke all the way across at this particular point. And that's a hinge line right in front of the 2nd row of columns. Now, way over here, along at this area, I think the pressure in there would be around to 7 to 10 pounds or something like that. But you can see in the building, and the evidence is there, the floor was lifted up, and the rebar was pulled out, and the remaining floor up, not down. So you had enough force over there to rip that up, and it was certainly not compatible with the demolition from the explosive out in the truck. And so there are just many, many things that you can look at that will show you and prove to you that the truck could not have done it by itself. This column collapsed way back here in the middle of the building, and the 1st and 2nd floor ceilings were taken out along this line, and well, this hole collapsed all the way up to the top, but this line here shows you the collapse in the 1st and 2nd floor ceilings. So there's a lot we could talk about on that particular chart, but I just wanted to show you that there's no way technically that you could have produced that kind of damage from 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. I put together this report and hand-delivered it to all 535 senators and congressmen. All 535. And we sent it out to over 500 mainline media organizations. and it was essentially covered up. And in this report, I said that the cover-up in Oklahoma, the effort to cover up what happened in Oklahoma far exceeds the effort required to do the bombing. And as time has gone on, I regret to say that that has been proven over and over and over again. Now, because of the report turned out there and the information that got spread around all over this country, and many people did similar analyses to what I had done with other experiences and other backgrounds and sent them to me confirming. I have never yet gotten an analysis from anybody that shot down what I had said. However, this report was put out last fall by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the American Society for Civil Engineering. I don't know how they conned the American Society of Civil Engineering into this, but they put this report out last fall. And what they did in this report, they assumed that the crater was 28 feet across and 6.5 feet deep, which is what the FBI had reported. And they took the FBI's reported size of the crater and said to have generated that size crater using military parametric data, it would have required 4,000 pounds of TNT. Now, the blast equivalence of TNT, it takes about 1 pound of ammonium nitrate in fuel oil to give you about the same blast equivalence you get from 0.27 pounds of TNT. So what you had was you would have to divide that 4,000 by 0.27, and it comes out to you it would have required 14,800 pounds of AFNO. No one has accused anybody of having 14,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil in that truck. In fact, it's kind of hard to put 14,000 pounds in a 2.5-ton truck. But that's what they were. So you have a gross incongruity between what they assumed and what was reported by the FBI. Now, the equivalents I show here, and these are proportional, these areas are roughly proportional to the pounds. Now, the 4,000 pounds of TNT is equivalent to 14,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. Or you turn things around the other way, the 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, which they said they were supposed to have had, is equivalent to, I think, was 1,080 pounds of TNT. Now, the trial was based on this, right? The trial in Denver was based on this, not this. Going back and looking at the overhead, you have the, this is the north side of the building. Here's the crater, and I've got several slides here I want to talk about the crater because you see the size of the crater is very, very significant with respect to how much ammonium nitrate and fuel oil you had, or how much TNT you had, or what the explosives were. Now, there's a tarpaulin over the crater here. Here is the building. It was terribly damaged right across the street. That tree that I was talking about is right straight out here in the middle of the parking lot, and it's closer to it than this building here. Here's the Water Resources Board that had building. It had a fairly small amount of damage. This is a picture of the tree. I went over and looked at it after the bombing down there, and it had one limb about the size of my wrist knocked out of it. One limb. Now, down the street where you saw that building, it was so flimsily constructed and was extensively damaged. And there, as you see, there's a corner right at the street. And there's only one little piece of rebar in that foundational structure there. Now, I want to point out another picture here. This shows you the offset from the big gap that went all the way back to the back wall in the building here where the column in the middle came out, and the bomb crater is way over here. Now, these columns, this column and this column, were much closer to the bomb than this one over here. In fact, this column saw 42% more impulse than this one, but this one came down and those two are still standing. In fact, the column on the other side of this one over here had about the same impulse as this one. It was still standing. So you have gross asymmetries. And you just don't get that. When you have an explosion, it goes out in a spherical way, unless it's inhibited by something. And the damage with this building was uniform from one end to the other. The construction on one end was about the same as the other all the way across. There were no load-bearing walls, no partitions. You had very light structures inside. And all the columns inside the building were covered with sheetrock on lath, just like you would have in your garage or your house. And some people were saying, well, the column here between this one and this one came down. This is the second row now, 35 feet from the front of the building. This column was brought down by demolition charges. The ATF had a weapons bunker up in the top floor there, and when the building collapsed, some of the stuff fell down and knocked down that other column. Well, it's technically impossible because, you see, when you had that failure line across, and all these T-beams coming out here, and if it had come down afterwards, you would have found the T-beam on this column would have come out just like these across there. So you can show analytically or structurally that the failure did not happen by a demolition charge going off after the front row had gone off. Now, after they had cleaned up the entire building, they permitted the Defense Council to take technicians and technical people through the building and look for evidence. But this is the building as the way it was just before it was brought down. And you can see the column that was here, the stub of the column is completely gone. The columns across the front row, the stubs of the column are completely gone, and that was a big effort to root out and get rid of those columns. They were hauled off and buried behind a chain-link fence with guards on it. And they had a big machine out there like you would use in surface mining, burying all that building stuff. So they had essentially sanitized the building before they permitted anybody to go and take a look at it. And this picture shows you the building before it was cleaned up. And you can see right here is the column back in the middle of the building, what I call column B3. There it is, standing up to the third floor. So it appears to me that the column had a demolition charge at the third floor level. And you can see the bare rebar sticking out in the way, just like in the top of that church records vault. When you have a demolition charge, you have a wave of deformation that moves through it. It doesn't do anything to the rebar, essentially, and it just turns the concrete to powder. Now, you can go back and make a metallurgical sample and look at it under photomicrograph and see grain changes in the metal, but otherwise you can't tell anything. Here is the column in the second row. It's pretty much smashed down. I thought before with the first pictures that you had the demolition charge there further up, but that's really the first floor level. And as I got more and more detailed pictures, that column was, you probably still had the demolition charge at the top because all of the rebar was cleaned out in the smashing down all the way down to the top roof ceiling of the second floor, second floor. Well, the first floor, I'm sorry. The transfer beam, that 3-foot by 5-foot reinforced concrete beam across the whole force of the building, roll back into the building 90 degrees. The next column is buried and you can't see it, and you see the transfer beam on over further. Now, I'd like to walk you across the front of that building so that you can see what happened. The first column on the left, there was no demolition charge there, and you didn't have the reach from the bomb to do any damage over there. But what happened when the other three columns were cut out from under the building, that transfer beam essentially fell down this way, so this area was in compression, this area is in tension, and you can see how the rebar was pulled out here in tension, and one of them broke. The second large column across the front, you can see the rebar from here going up and down and across all the way over here is probably about 15 feet up to the third floor. Is completely bare of concrete, and I'm sure most of that came from smashing down of the floor after floor after floor from a fairly high level of smashing this down. And if you took a photomicrograph metallurgical sample of the rebar here, you could very easily tell whether there was a demolition charge there and confirm it or not. But that column was cut off and disposed of and buried, and nobody will ever know really for sure what happened. Another significant thing about the crater is this particular picture. When you have a crater, and this is a crater in England, you always have a rim, and I learned this in developing runway cratering munitions. You always have, you can see the crater rim around here, and the soil under the concrete is rammed back under that rim. And you always get this. I've never seen one yet that didn't have this kind of effect. Where you over concrete, where you over soil, it's a different matter. But when you have the level and thickness of concrete as you had down there, you get that effect. And the top of that shows you technically what happens. Here's a picture of what you get in a cross-section of a piece of metal. You had a shape charge fired into it. And you see some lateral motion. And here you have the same thing fired into lead. And because the pressure is pushing out and the lead can move, you have the outward lateral flow from the pressure lateral flow. Now, if you put a layer of steel and a layer of lead, then you can see the very sharp distinction there where the lead is moved back under the next level. And you would expect that's the kind of interface you would have. This is lead and steel, but with concrete and dirt you get the same effect. You'd have the same sort of effect there. So you look at a crater and out front from and here's a picture of the crater, and it's the closest to the third column over. And the only place you can see on that crater where there is any overhang is along, well, I can't tell, but right in, it's, well, boy, this picture doesn't show it very well, but there's one little strip right here. Right in here, you can see the lip of the concrete sticking over the crater. And it appears to me that this big machine you can see up there at the top, it looks to me like they had scooted out all the way around that crater and taken off the rim. Well, whether that's the case or not, I don't know, but there's only one place I can see in the picture of the crater, fairly close up, that has that overhang. And the rest of it has been either pulled off or has disappeared. Here's a picture of before the cleanup started. And you can see water in the, right in here you can see some water. The debris is piled up here about 2 feet, and in the crater, the debris is still sticking out of the top, so it could not have been as deep as people are trying to make out. The next picture shows the transfer beam, and this is another picture of the crater where they're fixing to cover it up. And that's a 2x8 by 16 here, and this doesn't look to me like it's 28, 30 feet across. Now, this is the transfer beam, and going here, and here's where the next column is, and this is the one closest to the truck. In the FEMA report, they said that the column closest to the truck was destroyed by broussants, and that's where you think things turn to powder because of the very, very high pressure. And they said that column was essentially disappeared because it was destroyed by broussants. And you can see the transfer beam, and this is the bottom of the transfer beam straight adjacent to the truck. It's about the same distance from the truck to this transfer beam as it was from the truck to the column. And you see it's pristine clear. There's no damage, there's no spalling at all at that point closest to the truck. And had the column been taken out by broussants from the explosive, you would certainly have had extensive broussants kind of damage on this, and you do not. Now I want you to note the last column over here that came down is laying down flat. It fell outward. And you can see some effects of what I consider blast damage right in here, and I'll show you another picture. It shows you the other side of it. Here's the same column from the other side, and you have the same kind of a smooth, relatively grainy surface without the gross cracking that you get from a structural failure. So here again, it appears that you've had a demolition charge here at the top of that at the relative third floor. You can see the rebar here at the third floor. It has bent down, but over a little further toward the outside edge, close to the other column over there, you can see that the rebar was stripped up from pressure from below. Over there where the pressure was supposed to be on about 7 pounds per square inch, if you considered what they had as being what they reported. I put this up to show you that you have, this is sideways, this is the damage you get from just a sheer structural shear when the building was tumbling down. And this is a joint, this is one of the columns above the transfer beam, and you can see the mounting for the glass is on this face, and you can see the cleavage, you see the grock structure and the cleavage planes where you had the breaking of the column. And that in contradistinction compared to a situation where you have, here's a beam here, and you can see rebar out, and you can have the relatively smooth surface just like you would have with contact explosives. And this is in the debris, and this is the next column over, which did not fail. Now, there was a test run at Eglin Air Force Base, and this test structure was 40 feet wide, 80 feet long, and 30 feet high. And the Murrah building was 70 feet wide and 200 feet long and about 90 or 100 feet high. But this was integrally poured, reinforced concrete. And they put they put the equivalent of 830 pounds of TNT out here 25 feet in front of that building. The panels here, you receive the blast from the explosive face-on. There's a big difference in the damage and the impact that you get when you have a face-on explosive versus a side-on. If you look at along this area right in the middle of the panel up here, the blast would have hit it at 45 degrees compared to down to the bomb. The blast going through here, if you look at the flooring, it would have seen the blast wave at what you call side-on pressure. It would have been moving under the floor with the shock wave perpendicular to the floor. And you get the minimum amount of energy transfer and pressure in that way. And you see, there was none of the flooring broke out. These 6-inch panels were very flimsy compared to this Eglin structure. And the columns and beams across here had about 1/10 of the steel in them, and they were much, much, much smaller. The flooring here had a fifth of the reinforcement that the rebar had, that the building had, the Murrah building had. So if you make an analysis and a comparison of this, if you would have had the same blast equivalents against this building if the 4,000 pounds of TNT were 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil were 2.4 feet further out. This gave you the blast. It was 830 pounds. That's about 3,200 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. So you're about 23% less in this charge than you would have been in the bomb in Oklahoma. You know, now you can see what coupling of energy from a blast is just horribly, horribly inefficient against a hard structure target or a hard target. It's just terribly, terribly inefficient. Now here's where they stuck back in the other corner of the building a 500-pound Mark 82 bomb, and you can see the damage that was done there with that bomb inside the building only 4 feet from the corner. And you have another test where they had a 35 pounds of TNT equivalent here. There's 180 pounds TNT equivalent here, but it was in the casing of a 500-pound bomb. So that the energy was transferred to the casing with a high efficiency, and the energy from the casing was transferred to the columns and the walls with high efficiency. And that's why you really tore all that out. Plus, you had more effective containment of the blast. This one, you had 35 pounds of TNT equivalent in a penetrating warhead, and there's about 250 pounds of steel with that penetrating warhead, so it's 35. The charge-to-mass ratio was, what, about 9 or almost 9 to 10. So it was designed to penetrate a very hard structure. And you can see the flimsy construction. There were 4, I think, half-inch rebars in here compared to the 8 quarters, number 14 rebar in the Murrah building columns. And there were 3, 6, 9, 18, about 20 of them, where you had 4 1/2 inch. So this is a very flimsy structure compared to the Murrah building. Now, could something have been done with the 4,000 pounds of TNT, ammonium nitrate and fuel oil? They reported having found receipts for that. And if you're going to do it, you could take 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil and grind it to a fine powder and add nitromethane without letting the powder see moist air, because the moist air would be absorbed by the hygroscopic ammonium nitrate. And you could add about 1,000 pounds of nitromethane to that 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate, and you'd have a blast equivalence of about 5,000 pounds of TNT. Not ammonium nitrate, TNT. Now, to a facility to do something like that, you would have to have something that was never reported in the trial. Now, here's a picture of a little facility on the backside of a National Guard base between Tulsa and Oklahoma City. And this picture was taken, I am told, on the 6th of December, 1994, and appears to me to be a horizontal agate grinder. You have a pipe going in over here. You have all the equipment capability there for grinding ammonium nitrate into powder. There's a rider truck, and you have a little double screening around here, and then each one of these has a screen around it to keep anybody from seeing and knowing what's going on. Now, they went back and took pictures later of the facility, and there it is. So what was going on? I don't know, but it's something that I think the grand jury ought to take a look at. Now, let me turn this off and talk about a few things. In the bombing in Oklahoma, there has been a tremendous cover-up. The first letter that I wrote, the first report I put out, I said the level of effort to cover up was far, far greater. I said it dwarfs the area required to do the bombing itself. I could stand here and talk about obstruction of justice. I could stand up here and talk a long time about the cover-up. I could talk about prior knowledge. The pictures of those gentlemen standing back there in front of the building where it was cleaned up, Otis, the elevator guy, the company guy who had the company maintaining the elevators, he is en route to the Murrah building at the time it was blown up to do the periodic maintenance and check, and he was there within minutes. And the chief of the FBI, the ATF there, was testified or said that he was in the building and free fell 4 or 5 floors, kicked the door open and got out. Well, the elevator people said, and it wasn't so. It was just a joke. They said if it had free-fallen, it would have free-fallen up. And they checked all the 3 interlocking safety systems, and they were all functioning, and there was no failure in the functioning system. In fact, there was not a crack in the whole building. There's another report I probably ought to talk about with respect to Oklahoma, or really 2 reports. Dr. Whitehurst, I'm sure all of you have heard about him. He filed a report with the Inspector General for the FBI and had a lot of complaints about the poor job being done in the forensics in the FBI. And the IG for the FBI had a big study, and they turned out a very, very voluminous report, and it's been out now for some time. Somebody got it out by Freedom of Information Act. And in that report, Mr. Williams was the explosives expert on the scene, charged with the forensic work on the location in Oklahoma. And the FBI's report said Williams repeatedly reached conclusions that incriminated the defendants without a scientific basis, and they were not explained in the body of the report. This is the IG's report. We conclude that Williams' weight estimates was flawed because it was more specific than warranted by the application of forensic science, and because it was based in part on collateral information. And that collateral information was the receipts for ammonium nitrate found at one of the accused homes. Sources unrelated to laboratory or crime scene observations. Williams assumed that the main charge was AFNO. He assumed that. Well, the report goes on and covers a lot of things. The report also covers a lot of things on Oklahoma, on not TV800, but the New York Trade Center. Well, I talked briefly about 3 bombings. There have been 2 others that are quite significant. One is the New York Trade Center. We know that the Trade Center was a counterterrorism sting. In the trial, you had an Egyptian military officer, former military officer, was the go-between between the FBI and the Middle East terrorist group. And he had over 70 hours of tapes of his conversation with his FBI handler. And in the trial, those tapes were put under lock and key by the judge. But the transcripts of those tapes. But somebody leaked some of that to the New York Times, and the New York Times published their report of what had happened, and they laid it out in great distinction based on those tapes. And the plan was originally to use inert material and entrap the Middle East terrorist group, catch them in the act with inert material, and prosecute them for terrorists. And instead, they changed their mind and decided to use live material. And they got the truck in there, and it blew up and created a cavity, 6 floors, 2 floors up and 3 floors down as a football-shaped cavity. And the column they were going after went up over 1,000 feet, and there you had it completely bare standing through that six-floor cavity. The floors in the New York Trade Center were 11 inches of reinforced concrete. So we know that the Trade Center bombing was a counterterrorism sting, and I quote, they say, messed up. The New York Times published one article one day, one time. I have never seen it published anywhere else. Sometime later, before the sentencing of the Middle East terrorist group, the Wall Street Journal published an article that had quite a bit of information on it. But I think it's rather tragic that no one challenged what was going on, and the public in this country still doesn't know hardly anything about what happened. People are just totally dismayed to hear anything about a terrorist group up there. And the Egyptian officer, was given over $1 million to assist in the prosecution. Over $1 million. And he said, and he was told, the FBI, it's in the tapes, he said, you goofed, you messed up. You were supposed to have stopped it, you could have stopped it, and you didn't stop it, and I feel terrible because these people got killed. So we have a problem with the New York Trading Center, which was also, now, a counterterrorism sting. There is much evidence, much evidence that says the bombing in Oklahoma was a counterterrorism sting, and I think this is something the grand jury has to explore. I am scheduled to testify before the grand jury on the 17th of this month, and I hope things work out okay to do that. There's one more bomb which I think needs a little attention, and this cover up there. A 4-star general was assigned to head up a committee to go to Saudi Arabia. He's retired. He was assigned to go to Saudi Arabia and look at the survivability of the troops over there with respect to terrorist acts. So, in other words, looking at the counter-terrorist security in Saudi Arabia. And he came back and he reported to the Senate Armed Services Committee last December. And it was published, it was out on C-SPAN, I don't know if anybody saw it or not. But you had the Secretary of Defense sitting at one end of the table, and he said the bomb in Saudi Arabia was 20,000 pounds. The 4-star general just came back from over there, he said the bomb in Saudi Arabia was 5,000 pounds. And if you look, one of the best measures of volume of energy dissipated and energy in the bomb is volume of the crater. And the volume of the crater in Saudi Arabia would have been over 30 times the volume of the crater in Saudi Arabia, in Oklahoma. And if the crater in Oklahoma required 4,000 pounds of TNT, that would be roughly, as a first-order approximation, it would have been 4 times 30, which is 120,000 pounds. Well, you can't put that much in a big tanker, but you can put something in order half of that. And any analysis, I think, you would have to conclude, because of the crater volume, that you had pretty much a full capacity of that truck in that bomb. Now, why would you have one guy saying 20,000 pounds and another guy saying 5,000 pounds, and nobody in the Senate Armed Services even questioned it? But there's a big difference in being able to run a terrorist operation with 5,000 pounds. It's of an order of magnitude different than if you have 20, 40, or 60,000 pounds. One, you may have a terrorist group doing something like that, but you're dealing with state terrorism when you get into 40, 50, 60,000 pounds. I've learned since, more recently, from investigative people, that the The bomb was loaded in Yemen, and Yemen is a communist country, and it was driven with an escorting car into Saudi Arabia and parked, and they crawled in their car and drove back to Yemen, and the bomb was driven to the Khobar Towers by another group. But here you have, before the Senate Armed Services Committee, two very senior people in the United States, one saying something is different by a factor of 4, and it's really the difference between small terrorist operations and state-sponsored terrorism. Now, all of these terrorist acts make sense in a very coherent way. And the second part of what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to get into that and show you where these terrorist acts fit in the global scheme of things. Now, if you go back and look at the situation in Oklahoma, there was a group of people down there who were on the scene the day of the bombing. And one lady was down the street within the next block and saw the truck pull up and just sat there and sat there. Well, the people who were around it left. And then finally it blew up. And she was working with a group, she and another group of people, a policeman, an Air Force colonel from Tinker Air Force Base, and a whole bunch of people in Oklahoma, were working together doing some private investigative work. And there's a policeman involved with that group, Mr. Yaki. And he had a foster kind of suicide. I was told he committed suicide, but there were 3 units of blood in his car. He had his, and I have the biopsy report, he was cut on both wrists. The middle of his arms were cut, both cut, and he was cut on both sides of his neck. And he had walked across the field, across the ravine, into another field, and shot himself with a non-service revolver. And that was labeled suicide. You have had so many things going on. I'm sure all of you have heard about where did people have prior warning. There are many people who testified of people saying down there that they had prior warning and did not have to show up to work the next day. I have a friend who used to belong to the same church I belonged to, and he was retired, moved to Florida. He was in Ardmore, Oklahoma, the morning of the bombing. And when they were checking out of the motel, they had watched in the motel the bombing, what had happened. And when they went down to check out, there's an elderly lady at the desk, and they were giving her their condolences. And she said, "My closest friend has a son who works in the Murrah building," and she said, "I've already called her to see if her son was okay." And her friend told her that she had already called her son. And her son told her that he was okay. He was told the day before that he didn't have to go to work the next day. That was his story. I got someone to go to Ardmore, Oklahoma to check out the story, and the story was checked out with the woman at the motel, but he could not get the mother to talk, wouldn't even talk to him, as anybody would understand. There are just hundreds and hundreds of stories. You know, Edie Smith, who had the 2 sons, and Glenn Wilburn co-signed the effort to get the grand jury underway. And he died a few days ago, as all of you know. Really a tragic, great loss, because he was a great man. And he was very dogged in what he did, and he's, as far as I'm concerned, really was a hero. But I hope in the future that the grand jury will get to the bottom of the things. I intend to go down and testify and do what I can, and I'm sure there are going to be others who are going to be testifying. I was told, I went down and visited with the DA probably 3 weeks ago, and he said he wanted to be sure that everybody testified who wanted to testify. And I wrote back in a letter later. We had an exchange of correspondence. He wanted information. I sent a lot more information down there, and I suggested that it wasn't enough to have people who wanted to testify. They need to seek out all avenues to get to the truth, and some people may not want to testify who ought to be subpoenaed, and they ought to try to uncover, even if it requires hearsay evidence, to identify people, and that's not precluded in a grand jury proceeding. It may be in a trial, but not in a grand jury proceedings, because they are held in a secret way. I think the TWA effort, the investigation is still going on there. They still, though, have not found and not come to any conclusions. I have taken several avenues trying to get access and go up there and take a look at the cut, because I could tell in 5 minutes examining the cut across there if that was caused by a continuous rod warhead. And I think there are lots and lots of people who would make the same determination. But I have examined many panels and tests of CR warheads, and it's a very distinct kind of cut, and it's very discernible as a continuous rod warhead kind of a cut. The Oklahoma case is a civil case going on, and the forensic that I showed you, all that information was provided to me to do a forensic, and I did that, and there is a civil case, and whether they're going to get to the bottom of that, I don't know. Someone told me within the last few days that they had released, suspended some of the sentencing of some of the people who have been given 70, 80, 90 years down there. I'm not sure, but I hope that is the case. Because the Branch Davidians were really a religious group. I remember in 1949 when I was in, 1950 when I was in pilot school, I visited my brother in Oklahoma City, and he carried me over to the, they didn't call themselves the Branch Davidians at that time, but they had a complex over there, it was a campus environment, nice brick buildings and well-kept lawns, and at the time he told me they were out on some mountaintop expecting the Lord to return. And they had figured things out to the day, and when it didn't happen, they built the other facility or complex out in the rural area. But you had, in that situation in Oklahoma, in Waco, you had many statements made that were not true. The representation that had been made by a lot of people in the government was not true. They had a FLIR aircraft sitting over that destruction of the facility and burning of that facility from beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning when they first made the attack until the thing was burned down. And the IR film shows a tremendous a lot of things that had happened there that most of us don't want to believe the United States government had anything to do with. And that has been made into a movie. All that evidence is available in a movie called Rules of Engagement. They did, I think, an outstanding job on that film, but they can't get any of the theaters to carry it. They got a few little small theaters around the United States who have carried it. I don't know that they've got it on video that you can purchase yet, but it shows some of the things that I have shown here, plus it shows the IR by IR, all the things that are going on through much of that day. And things have been pretty much misrepresented to the American people. And I hope that the American people will keep the pressure on the Senate and the House to force these things to be investigated and the facts revealed. Because if we don't do that, you're going to have more of them, or different ones. You know, if you look at the legislation that they tried to drive through the Senate and the House, and they did get it through. But they did it because you had the bombing in Oklahoma. Would you have ever gotten that bill through without the bombing in Oklahoma? You certainly would not have. And the bill had been in the Senate and the House since around January. But it was really moved once the bombing went down. In 1992 and 93 and 94, you had the orchestration by somebody of a bunch of killings of children in this country with assault weapons. 92 and 93 and 94. At Luby's, McDonald's, schoolyards, drive-by shootings, all with assault weapons. And they got the bill through in the latter part of 94. In Scotland, you had some screwball go off and kill a whole bunch of kids, and then they passed legislation and went out and rounded up all the guns. You've had similar circumstances in Australia. And let me tell you something. That effort is going to continue. not Karl Marx, but Leon Trotsky wrote a book one time, and it was, the title of that book was In Defense of Terrorism. He wrote it in 1922. And the whole thesis of that book was the justification of terrorism. And he says, if you don't support terrorism, you don't support the cause. And another very, very significant comment with respect to that is Trotsky. Lenin made the statement that he's dealing with guns. He said several 100,000 businessmen, industrialists, and professional people were no threat to a revolution. But 10 million armed and independent farmers were a terror to the revolution. And that is why the most significant thing about the Second Amendment, it doesn't have anything to do with hunting rights. It has something to do with protecting your right as a last step to secure your security and maintain your security. And I want to show you a couple of quotes dealing with that. And here, George Washington has always been my #1 major hero. And he says, to the distinguished character of a patriot, it should be our highest glory to add the more distinguished character of a Christian. Valley Forge, when the dark days of Valley Forge, May 2nd, 1778. But here's what he had to say about firearms. Firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself. They are American people's liberty teeth and keystone under independence. To secure peace, security, and happiness, the rifle and the pistol are equally indispensable. The very atmosphere of firearms everywhere restrains evil interference. They deserve a place of honor with all that is good. It's always been amazing to me. You go to Switzerland, and everybody has universal military training, and everybody has arms, and they're around the streets and buses and anywhere because they have to do their duty, and arms are everywhere. And they have always had a fairly high level of preparedness, and they have not been engaged in any wars that I know of in my lifetime. So I think those are very significant comments. The last comment down there, a quote for a conservative, and I was involved in politics to quite an extent. When I retired from the service, Air Force, I became a precinct chairman, and I tried to do the very best job that I could. And then I ran for county chairman, and I got to be the county chairman. If you ever tried to run a 500-man committee by Robert Schulz, try it someday. When I had to say 20 people in there would like to see you dead, and the other people are out there supporting you. But I always used, and I've spoken to very large groups of people, and I've always used this comment here: prove all things and hold fast that which is good is my definition of a conservative. And I'd offer anybody, and I'd offer anyone in here, if they can come up and give me a better definition of a conservative than that definition. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, prove all things and hold fast that which is good. And that to me sort of tells it all. Dr. Whitehurst is only with the protection, I dare say, of Senator Grassley. He was relieved when he wrote all of his comments up about the failure and bad things going on in the forensics area and the explosives area in the FBI laboratory. He was not fired. He was put on leave with pay. He's not permitted to go in any of the facilities or buildings. And you have something called whistleblower legislation. But I dare say in Whitehurst's case and many others, it really isn't working, and there's a need for some further legislation, and I dare say many of you ought to do what you can in pushing for that kind of legislation, because what he did, he was criticized for fairly seriously. A lot of articles were written, and some by superiors in the FBI. But when the IG went through their very extensive report, and it's probably about 3 or 4 inches thick, most of his complaints were corroborated. In fact, things were, in my fault, in many respects, far worse than some of the complaints and things that he had specified. And But Dr. Whitehurst is today not permitted to go to work anywhere, and he's got lots and lots of legal bills, and he's so far in debt on those legal bills he'll probably never see the light of day again. But the whistleblowing legislation is not working. Now, in the next period that we go into after we have a break, I want to get into the program of the Third International and what you have seen in these bombings and the efforts to get gun control. They are very characteristic of the things you see going on today. And those things are going to escalate unless we get things turned around in this country and we get things exposed. Because of the effort that went into getting things exposed in Oklahoma, you have a piece of legislation which did not go through as they wanted it to grab guns and control things in a way that the people would be inimical with our freedom in this country. It didn't happen with the Trade Center. And it's going to depend on the people in this country to put the pressure on the Senate and the House to see to it that these things do not continue and that people get prosecuted for participating in these sort of things. Now, one of the federal emergency management area were very much involved down in Oklahoma. There are a lot of groups involved in what happened down there. And if this grand jury will come to completion and explore all the avenues that are available to them, I think we'll get to the truth of what happened in Oklahoma, and you're going to see some sad things come out that I'm sure most of us would not want to think that our... Someone asked the question during the break, what did McVeigh do in the bombing? And I figured it's worth going back and cover what I'd been told. I have a very good friend who spent many, many years in investigative work in the OSI, and he's been doing investigative work since for many, many years, handling very high-level cases. And he's very well connected in both the FBI and the CIA, and he went down to Oklahoma and did some investigating, and I was speaking to a group in Washington, and he came over and he made the comment. Someone asked him the same question because he just come back from down there. And he said, whatever McVeigh did in the bombing, McVeigh himself thought he was participating in a counterterrorism sting, and he was so compromised he's going to die for it. That's what he said. I have seen nothing to contradict that, and that may or may not be the case, but he was probably one of the most qualified people to make that assessment that I know of. And so many things tend to corroborate that. You know, in the work that I did most of the time in the military, I spent many years in the weapons development business. I was head of the Special Assistant for Advanced Weapons Concepts, the Air Force Systems Command Headquarters. I was commander of the Armament Laboratory at Eglin. I chaired the first Air Munitions Requirements and Development Committee in the Department of Defense, and in that job I was the blue suit, purple suited guy, and I had an 06 from all the other 4 services, and we were harmonizing the requirements for all air-delivered ordnance and all the affiliated and associated devices that go with it. And my last job was Deputy of Systems out at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with quite a few systems under my responsibility. And I also worked at one time in the requirements area. And when you lay down the requirements for a new weapon system, you establish the capabilities of that system to perform in various kinds of operational environments. And if it takes you 10 years to bring that system in after you have defined the requirement, and it takes you some time to get that the requirement defined and approved at all levels and echelons it has to be approved in, you're talking about 10 years before you have an effective fighting capability with that system. And sometimes it takes a lot longer than that. I started the Focused Energy Weapons Program in 1957. I sent out the first solicitation industry in 1957. I wanted to build a coherent optical frequency generator because I knew if I could do that and get a certain amount of power, I could have a very effective speed of light weapon. And when I left Washington on Tuesday, headed off on this trip, I saw an article in the New York Times which said the Air Force the U.S. government was fixing to test an anti-satellite laser, and they were questioning whether they should do it or not, and what's going to, all the ancillary problems with testing a laser against a satellite. Well, if you can vaporize a satellite out there with a laser, that's a certain kind of military capability. But that is 40 years since I first started that program. 40 years since I first started the technology for the focused energy weapons business. Things could have been done much, much, much quicker. I know I ran the effort for the first 2 or 3 years, and when the Kennedy administration came in, they wiped out the total effort plus the organization that was set up to do it. Now, in the area that I have spent all my time in the military, there's always a certain amount of anti-intellectualism in everything that you do. But here's a little quote that has always meant a lot to me in the military, because I was not the blood and guts fighter pilot, but I was still in the technological side. The nation that will insist on drawing a broad line of demarcation between the fighting man and the thinking man is liable to find its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards. That to me has always said an awful lot. Now, going back to this effort to establish a requirement for a system that you're going to take 10 years before you have it. For example, the B-2. It took more than 10 years to develop the technology for stealth aircraft. But even when you had done the technology, when you start to build a major weapon system, you're still talking about 10 years. And you're going to keep it in the operational inventory for 10, 20, 30 years. The B-52 has been around 50 years. Been modified a lot, but it's still been around 50 years, over 40 years. What do you use as a crystal ball to look ahead 40 or 50 years to determine what kind of operational scenarios you're going to be working in, and what should be the requirements and the capabilities of the system you're going to build? Well, in my life and time, in all the time that I spent in R&D, 25 years, I have never found but 2 things that have any real significant impact on that. And one is the extrapolation of technology. And we do a fairly good job at that. It's a fairly well-developed science, and I think looking back in the past and where we have come from and what we were anticipating, I think we've done a fairly good job in extrapolating technology. The other thing that I have found a very totally reliable basis for extrapolating the future operational scenarios that we're going to be involved in is the program of the Executive Committee of the Communist International. And that is a very, very specific document. It has the power of millions of people behind it and billions of dollars behind it. And I want to get into that. But I would like to go into a little of the origin of that. You know, when I was raised in a family, my father was fairly severely injured in World War I, and consequently I had a father with time to give me attention, and he was a very, very well-read person, and I consequently started learning things at a younger age than most people. In fact, when I was a paper boy from the 6th grade through high school, and I had a monopoly. I delivered 3 newspapers in my little hometown, and I read through 3 newspapers a day, and most kids don't start reading 3 newspapers a day in the 6th grade. But when I went off to college at 16, I had a left-wing professor, and if I wanted to write on a socialist or communist subject, I could make an A. If I wrote on a technical subject, I got a B. So I read most of the things that most anyone would be looking at studying in the socialist era and socialist ideas. It's rather interesting. This morning I called in a limousine to come over here from the hotel, go to the airport from the hotel, and the gentleman driving the bus was a very articulate gentleman from India. And I asked him where he's from. He said, Kerala. I said, well, does that Kerala still have a communist government? He said, oh, yes. And we talked a little bit, and he was pretty much a hardcore Marxist-Leninist himself over here. I don't know what he's doing over here, but He was the driver of the bus. But when you look back and look at the future, what is the operational scenarios you're going to be involved in? Who are your potential enemies? What kind of conflict situations are you going to be involved in? It is very important in laying down the requirements for that weapon system. And I said that the ECCI, the Executive Committee of Communist International, and the program of the Third International is the only real definitive thing other than the extrapolation of technology that makes any sense I've ever found any confidence in for extrapolating military hardware requirements. Let's go back a little in history. The communist system, as we know it today, and communism as we know it today, if you go back and look at Plutarch's Lives, Lycurgus, and the old city-state of Sparta, that was really the first communist state. And at the time Sparta was at their height, Athens, 90 miles away, was at their height. And you go to Athens today, and you look at that Acropolis from the little mountain close by, and it's still one of the most spectacular sights in the world. The Parthenon is there, and quite a few other buildings and structures from a classic Greek time. But 90 miles away, you can't find a pile of rocks big enough to take a picture of, but yet Sparta, a militaristic communist state, conquered Athens. The little Athens, and you would not think that could happen, but it did happen. Now, if you go forward several hundred years, and when Plato's Republic was written, what is Plato's Republic? It's like a college bull session with a bunch of students with Socrates discussing what should be the ideal form of government. And the conclusion is they should have, they go back to the old Sparta model and talk specifically about the Sparta model. And one of the biggies in both Sparta and the Plato's Republic, one of the biggest things in their socialist system, in socialism, was sexual license. They didn't know, in Sparta they said they didn't know that there was no such word in the vocabulary as adultery. And what they were putting together in this idealized state in the Plato's Republic was more of the same thing to a certain extent. But yet, in one of the latter chapters or books in Plato's Republic, he makes a statement, and the system is not going to work. And I remember in a doctoral program at Case Institute in Western Reserve, the professor was having us read Plato's Republic in a simulation course. And I pointed out that, hey, Socrates said it's not going to work in the latter part of the book. He said, oh, that was added later by somebody else. Typical education-ese kind of a thing. And you move on forward, and 25 to 50 years before the Declaration of Independence in this country, you had another program effort underway, and it was documented in this particular book here, The Anti-Christian Conspiracy, published in 1798. That's the year, I think, George Washington stepped down as president. And the key leaders in this effort were Voltaire, who was probably the biggest amoral reprobate of the 1700s, Frederick the Great, who was a notorious crusading homosexual in that time period, and a pretty bad guy, D'Alembert and Diderot, who were big leaders in the French Revolution. Now, these people were involved in developing a revolutionary transformation of the world. They called themselves the economists, and working clandestinely, they say, we're promoting business, industry, and agriculture. Then they call themselves the encyclopedists because they turned out a set of encyclopedias that was designed to swing Christian world into humanism. It was focused on the elimination of Christianity. And later they joined with the Illuminati and formed and called themselves the Jacobins, and precipitated the first communist revolution, which was the French Revolution. And it originally planned to establish this communist power base in France and spread to the rest of the world. And when Napoleon got kicked out of Russia, they decided they had to have some defense in depth, And they changed their strategy and their plan to conquer first, or to establish their first power base in Russia, and then move against the rest of the world. And by 1820, there was considerable revolutionary effort already underway in Russia. Now, when you go into a country and you want to try to precipitate a revolution, one of the biggest primary groups the communist world has always used is dissident minority groups. If you're going to try to precipitate a revolution in Atlanta, Georgia, what minority group would you use? The white community? If you're going to try to precipitate a revolutionary movement in South Dakota, what minority group would you use? You've got a big Indian population out there you could probably exploit. But at the time, when they started the revolutionary activity in Russia, one of the biggest dissident groups, or biggest minority groups in Russia, was the Jewish community. A lot of money was poured in. They set up and built new seminaries. They tried to convert the people in the Russian Orthodox Church. They set up new seminaries to do that. In the Muslim world, in the Jewish community, they set up new seminaries trying to divert and subvert religion to generate revolutionary groups. In Russia, the revolution went to the last big one they had over there before World War II was in 1905. And when the revolution ended in 1905, many of the people fled Russia and came to the United States, various cities in Europe, and were scattered all over the world. The people who were involved in the revolution when the revolution failed in 1905. So this group, back in Voltaire's time, when they were working toward establishing a system to overthrow Christianity and establish a humanist world out there, their first priority of effort was the total subjugation of public opinion. And that's not control of the media. It is a total subjugation of public opinion, which is far more sophisticated and much more complicated in the control of media, and the annihilation of the faith of all Christian nations. That was their thing. And the extension of the Jesuits and the extension of all religious orders and having apostates out there who are out there propagandizing impiety. And one little case in point, remember we had a crucifix inserted in a glass of urine, and it was paid for by you taxpayers, right? That's what you're talking about when you're promoting and propagandizing impiety, a typical case. And this was set in motion back there even before the French Revolution. Bestow academic honors on the impious. Find out who the humanists, the bad guys are, and give them all the academic honors. And the inundation of the world with anti-Christian writings. And these are sometimes called the Voltaire writers' colonies, and the objective there was to endow people to write books, 99% true with one lie. You'd write a whole book to imbue the reading public with that one lie. And that's what the old Voltaire's writer colonies would do, and you find that still going on today. Let me just give you a case in point of this business of the subjugation of public opinion. And it's not just the control of the media. So about 2 months ago, I was invited out to California by an affiliate of ABC, this news magazine. I'm sure many of you have seen it on TV, called Extra, program Extra. They gave me a first-class ticket and ran me around from everywhere I was going, from the hotel, the studios, and all over, in a half-a-block-long limousine. First-class treatment, hotels, everything while I was there. And we shot for about 2 hours the next morning, and I went back to Washington. A month later, the program was shown on TV on a Sunday, and they let me make a few points. What they showed, selected out of 2 hours, about 8 minutes worth. They let me make 2 or 3 of the points. They paraded me around. They were talking over me most of the time. They had me sitting at a table going over things with the moderator. And by the way, they had 2 producers working on it. I had spent quite a bit of time in the morning working out what we were going to do. And I thought the two producers were very objective and very helpful and very capable people. But then when the program moderator came in, the host of the program, everything was totally turned upside down and changed again. That he had a mission. And as it came out on the TV program, they let me make a few points. And then they stood the guy up there who was one of the key guys in that FEMA report which I showed you. And he was making a few comments, but most of the comments he was making, he was talking, but he was talked over by the host. And he completed the program. He said, and this is what the host was saying, but it made it look like this other expert was the guy who was doing the talking. And the host said, General Parton is a career military officer. He's not an engineer, therefore he really doesn't understand these things. Now, the whole purpose of taking me out there was to discredit me. They gave absolutely no credentials for me when they introduced me on the program. They had my resume. They knew I had 2 engineering degrees and 25 years in R&D. But he still said, General Parton is a career military officer. He's not an engineer, and he therefore doesn't understand these things. That is what you call controlling public opinion. That's what you call confounding the truth with a lie. And the media does it to you all the time. They will give you a little truth, and they'll confound it with a lie. They don't care about 1% or 5% or 10% of the people learning something or having the facts or having the information. Just don't let enough people have the truth to do anything about it, or exercise any influence, or exercise any political clout in the country. There's no problem with that. Let me tell you, I'm sure a lot of you in here have heard about Pavlov and his dog. You ring the bell, feed the dog. Ring the bell, feed the dog. And the dog gets to the point where the saliva will flow whether he beats the dog or not. Now, Lenin put Pavlov in the Kremlin. He had his laboratory in the Kremlin. And Lenin personally gave Pavlov credit for giving him the tools to preclude counter-revolution by the conditioned reflex or conditioned response. Now, this is exemplified in Pavlov's experiments with the dogs. So you had the dog trained. You rang the bell, the dog's saliva flowed whether you fed him or not, right? Then Pavlov took the same dog and conditioned him to a negative response. He put him in the same bare room and nothing in the room but a hanging light bulb in the middle, and he had a long cane. And he would turn off the light and beat the dog. Turn off the light and beat the dog. The dog had one defense mechanism. He could cower in the corner and he couldn't be hit with a stick if he was in the corner. Pavlov wasn't poking him because that was excluded, but he could poke him in the corner, but that he didn't do. So the dog got conditioned to something else, the light and the beating, the light and the beating, the cower in the corner. Then he took the same dog, one conditioned to a good stimuli and a bad stimuli, right? And he simultaneously rang the bell and turned the light off. So what did the dog do? He did nothing. He stood there and quivered. He was hungry, he wanted to eat, but he was afraid of being beaten, and he did nothing, he stood there and quivered. And that's what the psychiatric world calls a catatonic state. And when you are fed the truth with the lie, how do you separate them? And when you have the truth with the lie, do you want to take action? Just like the people out there, well, General Parton's talking about some terrible things that happened in Oklahoma, but yet he doesn't know what he's talking about. Should you march off and try to do something or take a position? No. So you introduce a catatonic state, and that's why you have so much apathy out there in this country. It's one of the primary reasons, because you have the truth confounded with a lie, and people don't know which is right. And it's another thing that you have also, when you have the truth so confounded with the lie that you can't separate them, and you get to the point where you cannot separate them, you're confused, you have induced another psychiatric state called delusion. And we find the same thing being generated by the media there, where you're confounded with, you have the truth confounded with the lie, and you don't know what's right or what's wrong. You are deluded, and you can't separate the truth from the lie. And I can tell you right now, I could stand here tonight, and I could tell you things that I know about, that I was personally involved in, or experiences I had, things dealing with national security issues and whatnot, and I could discredit myself by telling you truths that would be unbelievable to you, because you don't have the information base to accept or reject. And they'd be unbelievable, so you would reject them. So this is what stems when you have controlled media, and when you do what they're pointing out here right in the beginning, to the subjugation of the public opinion. And it's, believe me, it's a far, far more sophisticated thing and more difficult thing than controlling the media. You can control the media quite frequently by buying it. There was a lady on one of the stations in Oklahoma. She was an investigative reporter down there, and she was doing a fantastic job, and she was getting to the bottom of a lot of things. And what happened to her? She wasn't muzzled. The New York Times bought the station and fired her. What they considered her exposures that she was making down there were so significant and so important, they went down and bought the paper and fired her. And I have talked to the lady, and she thinks that's precisely why she was fired, because they went down and bought the station purposely to fire her. Now, when the communists took Russia, they set up the Third International in 1919. And the Third International is an international organization. You had communist parties set up in all the countries around the world, some big, some small, and there was a representation from all of those countries that came together as the Communist International and formed the International, the delegates from those countries. And from 1919 to 1928, they had a fairly large study group going, using their best brain power and smartest people they had all over the world, not just from Russia, from all over the world. And they came up with the program of the Third International, and that's what they call it, the program of the Third International. And they met at the Party Congress in Moscow and approved and adopted the program of the Third International at the meeting of the Executive Committee of the Communist International and the Congress of the parties from around the world. Now, from 1919 to 1943, the Executive Committee of the Communist International was run by the Executive Committee of the Communist International. But at the end of, well, in 1943, the Russians wanted Lend-Lease. Remember, they had a war with Hitler. And there were people like Senator Taft and other conservatives in the government in the United States who felt the Russians were as bad as the Germans, the Nazis, and they figured the best thing they could do was hit the one who was losing and let them bleed themselves to death, and we wouldn't have to worry about either one of them for 100 years. But they did agree to provide Lend-Lease if the Soviet Union would disband the ECCI, the Executive Committee of the Communist International, which is the governing body who was operating and running the program all over the world, not just in Russia. And they agreed to disband the ECCI. Earl Browder, who was the head of the Communist Party in the United States, later wrote a book, and he said they didn't even move out of the buildings. They didn't even change the marquee. They continued doing just what they were doing. But after World War II, the government in England, the counterpart to our State Department over here, assisted in rounding up and getting a hold of all the documents that were promulgated by the ECCI, the Executive Committee of Communist International. And they gathered them up, and they were published by Oxford University Press under the auspices of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Now, the Royal Institute of International Affairs is sort of a global think tank, in my opinion, supporting all of the leftist front causes. To me, it's kind of like the Institute of Policy Studies in the United States. I've looked and seen many of their studies, and it looks to me like they're writing studies and doing analyses that would provide good guidance to the people in the ECCI who are trying to run things over here in the Western Hemisphere. But if you go to the library today trying to get these documents, they're not there. You turn in, they're in the file cards, but they're not there. You turn the file card in, and they come back to your desk, and they say, well, we don't have it on the shelves. You send it to research, and they can't find it. So the documents have been pulled. If you know how the Library of Congress works, they have to have been pulled from the inside. But anyway, I tried to, I thought I knew everything there was to know about communism when I was a young kid in college, because I had studied and read all this stuff that I could get my hands on. But I was never in a position to anticipate and predict where they were going. But when I got a hold of these documents when I was at the War College, they weren't presented, they weren't considered in the school at all. I just found them there in the library. And when I found these documents, I found the real key to anticipating and predicting where the communist world was going, because they tell you in there what the total program is for transforming the entire world. I tried to get publication rights on this. They ignored me and put out another printing under Cass. The first ones were put out under the Oxford University Press. These were published by Cass. You can't quite see the publishing house on there. And this is a set of the new ones. At one time, I knew where 3 volumes were. One was in the War College Library in Maxwell, one was in the Pentagon Library, and I had a copy that I had Xeroxed. 20 years, 15 or 20 years later, this set was issued. They printed a dozen copies, not enough to satisfy any demand for their own use, and they're still not available. They're still not available. But in Volume 2, there are 3 volumes, and all of these documents are arranged chronologically. And in Volume 2, they have the program of the Third International, how they're going to transform the entire world, every square inch of the world, into a world socialist or communist system. There are supplementing documents that go with that. Now, at the Sixth Party Congress in Moscow, they did things in a very sophisticated way. It was really a precursor to a United Nations kind of a meeting. You had people from all over the world there, and they were conducting fairly high-level meetings, and there was a leadership from all over the world. Sometimes it was chiefs of state, and other times it was party heads. Now, here's another document that came out of the Sixth Party Congress in Moscow in 1928, the stenographic account of the Sixth Congress. And all of the documents, this contains all the people who attended, the delegations from all the countries who were there, what their positions were on various issues, and what the struggle was at the time. And the whole thing is a complete documentation on the world situation as they saw it at that time. I have those documents. Now, who was there? Who attended the Party Congress? There you see the tabulation of the delegates who were there from all the countries. They were there from all over the world. You see, from the United States, there were 20, and there were 5 alternates. When we have a convention, a presidential convention in the United States, you have delegates and alternates, right? They did the same thing. They had delegates and alternates. Alternates were not voting unless one of the delegates was not there. You had the same situation over there. Now, this is Russia is the acronym for them at the time. They had 50. 50 voting members, U.S. had 20. But you also had the Ukraine over there with another 10. And so they really were the big daddies in that convention, but they were still trying to promote the democratic process throughout the communist world through the Communist Party or in the Communist Party. There's another chart that shows some of the organizations that were there and represented. peasants, and the second one there is all the writers and people in the media, and the last one over there is the sports, international sports organizations. There are a whole bunch of outstanding people of international renown. About 28 of those were there, authorized to participate in discussions, but they're not voting people. And you come on down with these additional organizations, and you had really a final total of 532 delegates and alternates and people who attended that convention. It's as big as any United Nations meeting you ever had. And these things were conducted in a fairly sophisticated level. I show you the people who were there. This is the Chinese delegation of voters. The next one, you see the United States delegation of voters. There's William Z. Foster, who was head of the Communist Party in the United States at the time. This is the Russian delegation. There's not but about 25 or 30 there. There was 50 of them, and they stopped it. I stopped at the O, and when this thing was typed up, but Joe Stalin and all the others. You see, these Molotov, Mikoyan, and a lot of the people that you know and recognize today. If you look at the ECCI, the Executive Committee of Communist International, and the people who are attending the delegations in the last few decades, you have a different crop of people, but they're all names that you are more familiar with you at this time. Now, these are the three basic documents that constitute the program of the Third International. The first one, they call it the Program of the Communist International. And in the volume 2 back there, it's about a half an inch thick. And it lays out what they're going to do to transform the world. Now, in that program, there is a group of countries and a type of countries that are going to be transitioned to socialism by a particular kind of strategy. And they have another supplementing document covering how that strategy is to work, and they call it the Thesis on the Revolutionary Movements in the Colonial and Semi-Colonial Countries. And the basic strategy there is wars of national liberation. And it is the major thrust, and has been the major thrust of the Communist World Movement for the last 3 or 4 decades. And the last document down there is extracts from the ECCI resolution on the Negro question, which lays out what you're going to do in the black community in the United States and how you're going to interoperate that with Africa to transform the blacks in Africa into a communist kind of a system. And it's all spelled out, and you track what was laid out there, and you can see precisely what has been going on and how they've actually fulfilled what they're talking about. Now, they divided the world into 3 different kinds of countries based on their vulnerabilities. If you're going to have revolutionary transformation to communism in all these countries, they divided them into 3 different kinds of countries based on their vulnerabilities. Now, there are a lot of things other than just transforming power. In other words, taking, say, Cuba into the socialist communist orbit. The program called for a lot of things. One, they called for a global environmental program, spelled out back there in 1928. And the main thrust and main purpose of the global environmental program was to transform that engine that enables you to maintain national sovereignty into a dissipative war against the forces of nature. That's what the #1 thesis was. Of course, it's used for many other things, but that was the #1 thrust. And, for example, the Sino-Soviet split, which is a big front operation, and that was used to completely invert the power balance in the world. It was used to completely play havoc with the system of alliances that we have. Now, the first 3 groups are groups of countries that are to be transformed to socialism based on the inherent vulnerabilities. Now, at the end of World War II, a number of countries gained their independence without going to socialism because Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt wanted these countries pushed into freedom because Joe Stalin knew they would be vulnerable if they were pushed into freedom without being prepared for it. Now, they developed a strategy that they called the block within strategy. In the first place, it was and all of these countries here were to be transitioned by this block within strategy. The countries that had gained their freedom and independence, most all of them had a war of national liberation in what they call the preparatory phase. And when they gained the independence, that old strategy of a war of national liberation no longer applied. So they had to have a new strategy. And that new strategy was what they call the block within strategy. In the first place they applied it was in Egypt. Remember, after World War II, Farouk was put back on the throne, a man who had no popular appeal in the country anymore, and he was weak and could be overthrown. Nasser was sort of heading up something like a command and staff school over there, and he was able to identify all the students, leftist students coming through, and he built up a little cadre of followers, and he trained them. And then the Open Communist Party in in Cairo got out their gas cans and crowbars and started burning and sacking Cairo. He stood up with his 12 lieutenants, and Mubarak was one of those, and said, "I'm your law and order guy. We're taking over." He appointed General Naguib as the chief of state. He was a retired old army general, and he was highly respected, and nobody really objected to that. But the chaos in Cairo was such that anybody who could have brought order would have been put in power, and nobody resisted him. He just pulled a coup and took over with no resistance. In response to the Comintern, in response to the Communist Party out there burning and sacking Cairo. Now, I want to talk about the first group of countries. The capitalist countries were Western Europe, Australia, and Japan. They do not consider the United States a capitalist country for strategies of transformation. And those countries are to be transitioned to socialism by democratic processes. Free and open societies you can subvert, and with Fabian socialism and some other external influences later on, you'll be able to force them into communism. The second group of countries were the East European countries. Countries at medium level of development had fairly sophisticated governments. For some time, they had a good balance between business, industry, and agriculture. And those countries were to be transitioned to socialism by establishing a very militant unionism throughout those countries. And those were the East European countries that we know today. Militant unionism, co-ops in business, industry, and agriculture to break the back of business and the profit motive, and eventually transition those to socialism. They started trying to pick those countries off in the 1930s. You had the Poldovsky affair, they invaded Finland, and then Adolf Hitler and Joe Stalin decided to split Poland, and that triggered World War II. But they were starting to pick those off just before World War II, and it's really one of the major causes of World War II. So, as a consequence of World War II, all of the colonial and all of the countries at medium level of development transitioned to socialism as a consequence of World War II, and as you remember, they were essentially given to the communist world at Yalta and Potsdam. Now, wars of national liberation are a very sophisticated strategy and tactic for transforming all of these countries to socialism. I had on there the countries, the two different kinds of countries that are transitioned to socialism. What they call the colonial countries, and it's always an attack or assault or opposition to the colonial power. And the other group of countries that were to be transitioned, I had up there, I was showing to you before, was what they called the countries that were free and independent states but fell under the dominant influence of a major power. And they call those semi-colonial countries. Semi-colonial countries. So everything in the Western Hemisphere except the United States would be considered a semi-colonial country, and therefore to be transitioned to socialism by a war of national liberation. Everything in the Western Hemisphere except the United States. They have always considered the United States a colonial country based upon what they call oppressed nations within. If you listen to the speeches at the Million Man March in Washington, they called the United States a colonial country. They talked about the oppressed nations within. And I dare say probably 1 in 1,000 did not understand what they were talking about. But they're using 1928 program terminology. Now, the War of National Liberation is, they call it in that document, a 3-phase program. The first is a preparatory phase, but you have something that precedes it. You have to determine what the revolutionary schism is going to be in a country that you're going to exacerbate and take to a revolutionary transformation. And you have to organize a revolutionary council. Now, you take the leadership of the communists and you establish a revolutionary council. You may send in some leadership from Russia or somewhere else, just like in South Africa. The revolutionary council down there was really, in effect, the ANC, and Joe Slovo, KGB colonel from Russia, was the guy who was really running it. Of course, Mandela was the party head down there, but Joe Slovo was the guy who was running the War of National Liberation in South Africa, and today South Africa has transitioned to socialism with a socialist chief of state. So the first phase is a preparatory phase, what they call a preparatory phase. It's nonviolent, it's organizational, it's exacerbating the conflict thesis. When you determine the basis for the struggle, they all vary from country to country. Mao Zedong said there are many roads to socialism, and what he's talking about is that in all of these wars of national liberation, in the semi-colonial countries, they are all different. In the United States, the conflict to be exacerbated is racism. With the oppressed nations within, the blacks, Chicanos, American Indians, and in Canada, it's the French separatist movement. In Ireland, it's the Protestant versus the Catholic. In Rwanda, it was the Hutu versus the Tutsi. It was tribal. South Africa, it was part tribal and part racial. Buthelezi, a Christian part of Africa, is still struggling, he thought he was going to have a state down there, but he was fooled by Mandela, and they're not going to let them have a separate state. So you have a different revolutionary struggle in all these countries. In the Middle Americas, in South America, much of it, they treat the United States like a colonial power, so it's anti-United States, the big daddy to the north in a lot of those countries down there. They're very similar. And then you have what they call the period of escalating violence. Once you get that country to a certain stage and then you're ready to move in the period of escalating violence, and what characterizes the period of escalating violence is what you see going on today. You start off with political assassinations, bank robberies, raising funds. They call fundraising. That's what they call it. Brashio, accused of being one of the John Doe 2s down in Oklahoma, he was arrested out bank robbing. He was not picked up or charged or anything in the bombing down there, but he was later arrested out fundraising, bank robbing. So, in the period of escalating violence, you move on into terrorist acts, more terrorist acts, limited war, urban guerrilla warfare, limited war. You take the violence up as far as you have to go to transfer power. And the reason you're having all these bombings today is that you are now at the point of moving in the period of transition from a preparatory phase to the period of escalating violence. And that's what is now happening. Now, once you get to the point where you can take power, like Castro took power in 1959, then you move into what they call the period of exploitation. You use that country as a base of operation against the next target country to keep the blame off the Russia-China heartland, because somebody might get excited if the Russians or Chinese were in Cuba, but they probably are. But if it's an indigenous thing led by Fidel Castro, they couldn't be maybe not so concerned. But Cuba is still in the period of exploitation. Nicaragua is still in the period of exploitation. A lot of people think you have total freedom down there, but I had a meeting with the ambassador from South Africa before the present ambassador, and when also the military attaché, and he had just been in the meetings with the Cubans and South Africans and Angolans about getting the Cubans out of Angola. And they were rotating these meetings between Cuba and Angola and South Africa. And he had just come back from one in Cuba, and he said he decided at the dinner they had before they left down there that he was going to needle the Minister of Defense, and he said, "You guys really goofed in Nicaragua and got yourself kicked out." And his response was, "We haven't lost anything in Nicaragua. We still have all of our people in place. We control all the departments of government. We ran into some economic difficulties and had to make some temporary arrangements." And so that's, he said, the attaché said, "I was very, very, very surprised to see that he would admit that, but I knew that it was true and that he knew that it was true." In the preparatory phase, let me give you just one little case in point and an example of what you do in the preparatory phase. You're trying to exacerbate the revolutionary struggle. And then Philadelphia, Manning Johnson was a member of the Communist Party Central Committee, and he broke with the party and wrote a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. And in that book, he laid out some of the things they were doing up there in the preparatory phase. They were going to the black community and say, "You guys ought to go out and build your own black-owned and controlled shopping center, your own black-owned and controlled bank. Quit giving all your money to whitey." And they turned right around and worked behind the scenes to keep them from getting the financing, keep them from getting the zoning, to keep it from happening. What were they doing? Generating revolutionary hostility and revolutionary justification and fooling the most elite. And a continuation of those things over a period of time, you get to the point where you can move to the period of escalating violence. Now, many, many, many countries are in that period of exploitation. Now, who was running this? Who was operating this thing? Now, back between 1919 and 1943, it was run by and orchestrated by a Pentagon-sized operation called the Communist International, or the Comintern, but they had people and agents all over the world. But you're talking about a Pentagon-sized operation there. After World War II, they changed the name to the Cominform, or the Communist Information Bureau. And so it's like building a house. When you start off building a house, you're concerned about getting an architect or buying a lot, but later on you're concerned about the house being painted and the landscape architecture. Same thing through the communist program. What you're doing 50 years ago is not what you're doing today, and it's not going to be what you're doing tomorrow, but there's a continuum of efforts and things. In the mid-1950s, they changed their name to the International Department. When Trudeau in Canada stepped down as the Prime Minister, he went to Moscow and he stayed over there. It was reported he stayed over there working for the International Department. He's back now. When Philby, who was the UK representative of the United States when they were setting up the CI, he was about to be exposed, and he fled to Moscow and went to work for the International Department. So the International Department was really their biggies, their brain power from all over the world, who were orchestrating the program from Moscow and this big headquarters staff over there. I had the opportunity I saw it with Perestroika. I knew they were going to change the name again because maintaining the International Department was inimical with Perestroika. I knew they would change the name again or move it or do something. The people in the UK thought they had moved it to India. I knew for sure that wasn't the case. And I found out through intelligence sources that it is now the Gorbachev Foundation. They're operating under that name. Now, the Gorbachev Foundation out in California is just the branch here in the United States. There are branches in other the major G7+1 countries and quite a few others. The Gorbachev Foundation. And you have the same continuum of people. I had the opportunity to have an interview with a fairly high-level Russian official. He had been an admiral in the Navy, the Russian Navy. His son was flying off of a carrier. He had been the governor of Kamchatka. He had been a member of the upper house of the Duma, which is their Senate. And he was over here with his son attending high school. I've often wondered if he was over here for legitimate reasons. He hit 39 of the 50 states, and he hit all the countries in North and South America while he was over here running around visiting with his son who was in high school. But you had the same continuum of people and the evolution of that continuum through all these countries who were running that. Now, looking back in the past, what has happened in bringing countries into the communist world camp? A friend of mine in the Washington area had this tabulation. I used to keep my own little tabulation of year by year by year the addition of communist countries and countries transitioning to communism. The list goes on down. It's longer than you can put on that Xerox. But a number of the countries he has listed over here, many of those are now communist countries. But he's not reflecting there. For example, Iraq, the first country to transition to communism by what they call the bloc within strategy was Egypt. The second one was Iraq. And why would you expect Saddam Hussein to behave any other way than the way he's behaving? Now, I know I'm just about out of time, and I hope to spend a lot more time talking about what we need to do about this. And what we've got to do about it, what we have to do about this is take this country back. And the problem, we have lost this country, or we're losing this country. The big problem is because the American people have given up one of the greatest God-given rights we have in this country, and that's self-government. Our founding fathers gave us self-government, and we are not exercising self-government. In the United States, you have about 1/3 of the people who are eligible to register and vote don't register. So that leaves you 2/3 out there to vote, right? But in even a presidential election, half of those don't vote. So you have 1/3 of the people are participating in the process. And 1/6 plus 1 can win. If you have 2 candidates, it takes less than that. 1/6 plus 1 is minority government or minority party. And that's the situation we have in this country. The Christian church has turned away from it. Pastors will tell you stay out of politics, it's dirty. And the communist world, Moses Hess, this is a very important point, who introduced Karl Marx and Engels to communism, he tried to formulate the world program of the Communist International, and the communism as they knew it back then. He tried to imbue the people with regarding the end times Christian scenario and the end game of communism as one and the same, to nullify Christian hostility. In other words, if you could sell the communist program, and the end of the communist program being a new world government, a new communist world government, and you could convince the Christians that, hey, that new world government is what you're regarding the end times Christian scenario. I remember one Christian magazine, and they said in that magazine, a newspaper, that we should not resist the New World Order, we should not resist what is going on, because we should look for that, look forward to it. We should support it and help it, because the sooner this communist world revolution goes to completion, the sooner Christ will come back. The sooner we have world government and the New World Order, Christ will return. And people are misinterpreting that and very, very foolishly dissipating or not participating in the process because of that. I could go on and talk about this for a long time, but the American people have got to take back the political process. And it is not that difficult a job to do. I thank you very much. I'm going to be pulled off the podium if I'm not taken out. Thank you very much.
Actually, what a blessing. What a blessing. We appreciate you coming in to speak to us. And we're honored to have a speaker of your caliber. And we want to have you back at the Prophecy Club again. Now, as we're looking at all of this, you know, we could see the Oklahoma City bombing, and we could get angry. And we can see what they did in Waco, and we could get angry. What they did to TWA Flight 800, we could get angry and say, "Arr," and shake our fist at them. But, you know, this is not our home. We're just passing through. Amen? We're supposed to be looking up on a higher plane. So let's talk about that higher plane. How do we get to heaven? How do we get our name written in the book of life? Because all of these problems we've heard about today only point to the fact that time is very close. Time is very near. Judgment is coming on this nation. Judgment is coming on this world. So how do we prepare? Now, really think about that. Someone just at the break there said, well, you know, some folks are preparing physically. And to that I would say, do as God tells you to do. If He's telling you to prepare physically, then you should prepare physically, with whatever way God is telling you to store nuts for the winter. But I'll tell you that seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and His righteousness must come first. Amen? And I'll tell you that if we have all of the physical preparations we can possibly have, and we don't have Jesus in our heart, then we're in trouble. So, how do we get Jesus in our heart? How do we get our name written in the book of life? Let me ask you a question. Put you in the situation. You're in your car. Your husband or wife is in the car with you. And you're in a big hurry. And you pull out and you're grabbing gears and you're in a big hurry heading someplace. And about this time, a motorcycle whips out in front of you. You lose control of your car. The next thing you know, boom, you hit a pillar. Princess Di just had the same thing happen to her. No one expected her to go. But let's say it happens to you. Next thing you know, the pillar hits you in the face. You wake up, you're at the pearly gates, and there's Jesus, and he says, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you say? Now, don't answer out loud, but mentally, what would you say? And don't just look at me. Don't just watch the videotape. Answer the question. What would you say? There are those that would say, well, I've been a good person. Some would say, I haven't tried to hurt anybody. Someone would say, I read the Bible. Well, if any of those were your answer, his answer would be, get the hints, for I never knew you. So how do we get our name written in the book of life? How do we get the sins washed off of our heart so that when trouble does come, we'll get God's protection? Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So step number one, we have to realize we're a sinner. Next thing is we have to realize we can't earn it. We're not good enough to go to heaven. It's only on the coattails through the blood of Jesus we can get there. And it says, Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for it is by grace you are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is a gift from God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Okay, if it's a gift, then how do we reach out and take that gift? Romans 10:9-10 gives the answer. It says, if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God has raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For the heart man believeth unto righteousness, but with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. What's that saying? It's simply saying it's not enough to believe it, not say it. It's not enough to say it, not believe it. Got to believe it, got to say it. Acts 2:38 says, repent, be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. But the key word there is repent. There's a lot of folks out there walking around, and you say, you a Christian? Yeah. Well, when did you receive Jesus? Well, I don't know. And they can't tell you a time. You see, we need to repent. If there's no change in our life when we receive Jesus, then perhaps you got to wonder if you were really saved. Repent. See, in my life, I sat down one day and I said, Lord, I made a mess of my life, living it the way I want to. I'm ready to come back to you. And I'll make you a promise. I'll make you a covenant. I promise from here on out, if you'll forgive my sins, if you'll give me another chance, from here on out, I'm yours. From here on out, I will do my best to follow your laws. That's repenting. Holy Spirit, I ask you to go out into the video and into the audience here and also on TV. To whoever may be watching, knock on the hearts of those people whose names you want to write in the book of life. Those people you want to wash their sins away so that you can protect them when trouble comes, that they'll not put it off, and make that decision now in Jesus' name. Let's all pray. No one looking around, all heads bowed. Say it along with me. Yes, you've said it before perhaps, but let's say it again. Still feels good to say it again. Dear Heavenly Father, I admit I'm a sinner, and I confess with my mouth, and I believe in my heart that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, died on the cross, arose 3 days later, sits at the right hand of the Father. Ask him to write my name in the book of life, keep me holy, and save me in the day of trouble. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, it's not over, because Matthew 10:32.
That circle about 150 feet in diameter. The warhead has already functioned in the center. That's about the extent of the expansion of the detonation products from the warhead. And because you had the warhead was surrounded by a heavy double layer of rods, metal rods, the detonation products went off to the end, the so-called end effect. But I bring this up to show you what a continuous rod warhead is, because it's very significant with respect to TW-800. Now, those rods, when the warhead goes off, you have an accordion expanding hoop or circle moving out 5,000 or 6,000 feet a second, cold rolled hard steel rods, but they're all welded at alternate ends so that you have an expanding scissoring expansion of that circle, and it's continuous. And the most difficult thing is to design the warhead so it is continuous and has the proper velocity. Now, we had a shoot-down of TW-800, and here's the results as shown in the where they assembled that aircraft back together in the hangar up on Long Island. And if you saw the continuous rod warhead, it would reach out pretty far. If you had an aircraft out there, instead of those aluminum sheets, it would have sliced an aircraft in two just as well as it would have those aluminum sheets. Now, it was announced that it could not have been a missile that brought down TW-800. Why? Because they recovered all 4 engines, and none of the 4 engines showed any missile damage. They had blinders on, only thinking about IR-guided small missiles, shoulder-fired, aircraft-fired, or some other IR-guided missile. Well, an IR-guided missile is no good for all weather purposes. And if you have an aircraft going to attack a city with an atomic bomb or an aircraft carrier, and it's in the soup, and it has capability to deliver the weapon with the radar, IR missiles are no good to you. So we use this kind of warhead in many applications for surface-to-air missiles, because they have an all-weather capability. And if they're proximity fused, and they can reach out quite a distance, you can have considerable inaccuracy in that guidance system and still destroy the target if the warhead and fusing system is compatible with the reach of the warhead. And what you do is you have a fusing system, and is looking off at an angle, and when it intercepts the target, the missile fires, and the rods go out in an expanding hoop and slice across the aircraft just like a saber across the watermelon. Now, you could use a fragmenting warhead, what you call a blast frag warhead, and you send out, instead of sending everything in a strong, long, continuous cut, you send it out in fragments. You may punch a bunch of holes in something, and you'll destroy maybe some systems in the aircraft, but you're not going to get a catastrophic structural failure unless you hit the system. But with all-weather guidance systems, you have longer wavelengths. You're using semi-active or active radar, going after a beacon or transponder or a carrier wave, and you're dealing with longer wavelengths. You have a small aperture on the missile, so you have accuracy problems. And if you miss the aircraft 35 feet or 40 feet with that kind of warhead and with that reach and proximity fusing, you'll still slice it in two, so it doesn't matter. So if you look at the TW-800, across, you can see that from this point forward, and this is the forward end of the aircraft, you have a continuous cut from the top all the way down to the bottom. And this part of the aircraft was separated from this part at that point, and the nose of the aircraft went down integrally. It wasn't torn up at all. It went down in one piece, ballistically straight down. Now, at the time the warhead hit it, you had about 5 pounds of pressure for pressurization in the aircraft. So when the warhead hit it, and it cut it in two, you had instantly about 250,000 pounds pushing it apart because of the pressurization inside the aircraft. And it appears to me the first point of contact with the warhead was right here, and you can see the evident explosive decompression dropping the pressure very quickly from the first contact with the aircraft. But as big as the aircraft is, 747, it took considerably longer time for it to exhaust the gases out with the push going forward. Now, from this point back to this point, it looks to me like you had another continuous rod that hit the aircraft here, and it even went down into the wing. The ends of the pieces here you see are structural cuts from the recovery of the aircraft from the bottom. Now, from this point to this point, you can see a lot of discoloration and smoke and heat damage. But there's no severe fire damage because you can see that that dichromate paint is still yellow. There wasn't any burning hole there, just turned to dust. And you had, of course, fairly high dynamic gas pressures going down into the bunker below. And the red flag in all these pictures will denote a burned or charred body, and there's a body, and you can see the ribs there. But down inside of the bunker, there were 28 women and children, And there is the bunker after the fire. The tank drove into the building and stayed for some time. It pushed, there's all the kitchen stuff. It went through 4 walls and a kitchen, and all that was pushed up against the building. You can see the coal-poured concrete lines in that picture, and they're all cracked from the pressure inside, all corners around the top and down the corners on the side, because when the gas pressure from that demolition charge went into the building, it tended to blow it up like a balloon. So all the external walls were in tension. This picture shows you the building, and the back side of it, you can see the little hairline cracks all up and down here and here. Now, it was reported that that explosion was a propane tank. That was what it was blamed on. But there's the propane tank. There's no damage to the propane tank. There were some pictures, reported pictures of it that showed this end blown off, but they were doctored pictures. But there's the propane tank. You see the tension cracks. You had the pressure inside the building. And I'm told by the investigators, the chief investigator for the case that's being tried, and I was asked to do this forensic. The only reason I got into it, I was asked to do this forensic, and I was provided all this material on it. I was told that the building, the tank, had never even been serviced. There had never been any propane at all. Now, it's obvious to me that the room inside the bunker had been prepped for this picture. You have all these guns stacked against the wall, but if you notice here, there's a gun against a gun and a gun against that gun, and there's about 3 or 4 guns together. Now, if you had the equivalent of 3 or 4 F-16 jet blasts down in here, I don't know how you burned those and left them stacked against the wall with the gas dynamic pressures and gas flow in there. Secondly, from the spall from the hole in the top or anywhere else, you never find it lined up around one wall and not around the other walls. It would be symmetric to the hole or something else. So the room was quite well prepared for that picture. So what happened down there at Waco? There are a lot of things and a lot of misinformation put out, and I just pointed out some of the things in misrepresenting the truth with respect to what happened at Waco. They went back in and they scraped down to get rid of all evidence. All the building there was crushed and hauled away and disposed of, and then they went back in sometime later and scraped about 8 inches of soil up to get rid of all further evidence. Now here's the Murrah building in Waco. This has been a great heartburn to most American citizens. And what happened in the demolition of the building or the destruction of the building at Waco, this column, and this column collapsed across the front, and one column back in the middle of the building. Back in the middle of the building. When I first saw and heard the evidence about the bombing in Oklahoma, and saw the pictures of what had happened, with my background, I knew somebody was lying and not telling the truth. And I stuck my nose into it because I felt somebody had to try to get to the bottom of the problem and expose the facts. And because of my background, I said, if not me, who, and if not now, when? So I went down to Senator Nichols' office and talked to his assistant who was handling things for him in Oklahoma, and I tried to get him to go to Oklahoma or get hold of the people in Oklahoma and get a separate and independent investigation of what happened in the building. He told me 2 days later that there was a big difference of opinion in Oklahoma with respect to what happened. I knew then he was going to do nothing, so I put together a technical report and analysis, my bomb damage assessment of the building, and I concluded there had to have been demolition charges in the building. The 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil outside could not possibly have done the damage. And I sent that report to about 75 senators and congressmen. Now, the response back to me was minimal to almost a black hole. One senator wrote back and he said, I intend to withdraw my support, sponsorship of the anti-terrorism bill, and I will work to see that it is cleaned up. But what happened? The Senate and the House, they were crawling all over each other trying to ram that counterterrorism bill through, which would remove a lot of your constitutional guarantees. And the Senate rammed it through without going to a committee, And we got enough, I think, interest and concern on the part of the Senate and the House the House drug their feet, and it took them a year to pass the bill. But when the nose came off, it probably pitched up a little in the seats and things coming out. You can see the streaks across the aircraft from that damage. Now, from this point back, you had this part of the aircraft saw intense heat and flame. The paint is severely charred all along here. In here, you can see the aluminum skin is melted out between the ribs and the stringers. And so you had this part all in here was separated and came down in random parts spread all over a big area. But from here back, came down together. And probably the most qualified witness who observed what happened with TW-800. A guy by the name of Major Myers, National Guard pilot, he was in a helicopter, he headed right straight out to it, looking at it and saw it, and he had a lot of experience in Vietnam. He saw many missiles going after and hitting aircraft. And he said he saw two bright white flashes, just a few milliseconds apart. And when they shot, the Vincent shot down the Iranian aircraft in the Gulf War, what did they do? Fired two missiles. 007 was shot down by the Russians. What did they do? Fired two missiles, air-to-air. And it's standard procedure. If you're going to bring down a target with very high probability, you fire two missiles, because you always are confronted with not only just inaccuracies, but you're confronted with reliability of the system. So it's normal to do that. And they were just a few milliseconds apart, those flashes. The first flash was clean and clear. The second flash grew into a fireball. And that tells me that the first one cut here. The angle is tilted a little up, and the cut was across the plane, tilted just a little bit. And it was a forward intercept, and the guidance law of the missile would make it converge on the trajectory of the aircraft. So the first one cut along this line, and the second one cut along this line, and it got right down through here, and it probably got into the wing tanks outboard of the fuselage, as well as to the main fuel tank under the fuselage. Well, this tank is usually empty, probably have 100 gallons in there of fuel that you can't purge, but you had, after it got burning well, you had a lot of fairly violent exhaust of gases from the burning as the back part of the aircraft was going down. But all the section in here was probably torn up aerodynamically as it was coming down because of the big cut here, but you did not have the forces to pull it off clean like you had the forces to pull it off clean here. So it peeled off separately, and you can see it was scattered all over when you look at the pattern of the deployment of all the components from that aircraft. Now, if it was a surface-to-air missile, I got all the information I could on TW-800, as much of the witness information, and looked as much as I could, and I sent a fax to the chief investigator up in New York. And I said, looking at all the information, I can only come to one conclusion. The only thing that's totally consistent with all the information out there is that that aircraft was brought down by a continuous rod surface-to-air warhead, continuous rod warhead fired from a surface missile with proximity fusing. And if you don't have anybody who knows anything about the terminal ballistics of a continuous rod warhead damage to an aircraft, I'd be happy to come up and give you a hand. I did not get a response. I did not anticipate getting a response. Now, I was told within 24 hours by someone who was fairly well connected in some of the intelligence area that the aircraft they had been tracking a submarine from up around the St. Lawrence Seaway down the East Coast, and it was missing. They lost contact with it there in the New York Bay. Now, if it was a submarine that fired the missile, there are several countries that have sails. They have surface-to-air missiles in their sails. That is a part of the submarine that sticks up. We have none. In any of the American manufactured submarines, none of ours have missiles in the sail. The Soviet manufacturers, some of them do. Iraq has them. Iran has them. So I don't know whose submarine it was. Now, Pierre Salinger came out with a story. There was friendly fire, trying to blame it on the United States Navy. That story had been on the internet for many months before Pierre Salinger gave it some credibility. But the author, the editor and publisher of Soviet Analyst, probably one of the most brilliant men I know, tracking what's going on in the world today and from an intelligence point of view. He is also the editor of Golitsyn's book, Perestroika Deception. How many have read Perestroika Deception? Nobody? It's probably the most significant, one of the most significant books of the 1990s. A book he wrote earlier, New Lies for Old, back in the 1980s, was probably the most significant book of that decade if you're trying to understand what's going on in the world. And he devoted a whole issue to Flight TWA 800.
Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. As you can tell, we have an enthusiastic crowd here tonight. The title of tonight's talk is Globalism, the Program. Now, we look around and we see all kinds of things going wrong. We see the Waco situation, the Oklahoma City bombing, Ruby Ridge. Are all of these connected? Are they all part of a well-laid-out program? Well, you're going to find out that answer tonight. Our speaker tonight spent 31 years in the Air Force, where he earned the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit 3 times. He was a distinguished graduate of the Air War College. He went on to research and development management, weapon systems concepts, guided weapons technology, target acquisition aids, focused energy weapons, operations research applications. He directed 1,200 personnel who developed the Maverick missile system, the optical laser and missile system, imaging infrared guidance system, precision location strike system, the fighter attack system, and a whole lot more. His resume goes on for several more pages. Tonight, he will tell us that in 1928, the communists wrote the program to bring in the New World Order, and he says they're following it step by step. By knowing where they have gone, and by looking ahead where they're going, we can see where we are today and what's coming. Will you help me welcome General Ben Parton?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. I know you may wonder why, as a retired Air Force general running around the United States talking about bombings and the Communist World Program. But in 1947, in the National Defense Act of 1947, when the Air Force was separated from the Army, all of the development capability for developing weapons for air delivery stayed in the Army. It did not go with the Air Force. So in the early 1950s, the Air Force decided they were going to get back in the weapons development business to exploit new technology and overcome a lot of major operational deficiencies. And they set up a program for bringing in a few graduate engineers into eight quarters of graduate work in armament engineering, and I was one of the first 6 of those people who were trained quite extensively in all the gory details of weapons and munitions and explosive training design and all the things that go with it. And I stayed with that work for quite some time. I flew 25 years in the Air Force, but most of my time in the Air Force was still in the research and development side of things. After I attended this 8 quarters of graduate work in armament engineering, they give you a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, but the breadth of the course was such that they're giving a master's in almost several other areas. After I finished that work, I went to the ballistic research laboratories at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Maryland, because at that time that was fairly much the mecca of the conventional non-nuclear weapons development area in the United States, excluding the chemical biological. And I worked there for 2 years through several of the laboratories. Most of my time was in the terminal ballistics area, and I spent most of the time there developing the continuous rod warhead for the Beaumark missile. And the continuous rod warhead is probably one of the most difficult and most complex warheads in the non-nuclear area, and probably second only to the pit design in nuclear weapons. But this is a picture of a continuous rod warhead that was being tested out at China Lake. And you have a circle there about 150 feet across. Probably the radius is about 75 feet. And these panels around the periphery of that circle are sheet aluminum 4 feet by 8 feet. And you can see the panels all around the circle are being cut continuously around. He said, do the American authorities know at the highest levels that TWA Flight 800 was destroyed by a missile or missiles launched from a submarine off Long Island, and are they preparing to cover up this act of war? That was his conclusion from, and he covers a tremendous amount of information in this newsletter. Was it an act of war? I don't know. But the point that he makes in here is immediately after TWA 800, within days, there was a G7+1 meeting already planned in Europe. And at that G7+1, which is the moneyed countries of the world plus Russia, the one is Russia, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. He said they turned that meeting into a counterterrorism meeting. And in that meeting, they agreed to have a free exchange among the G7+1 countries on all terrorist and counter-terrorist activities in all of these countries. And he says it was well worth it to them to have gotten an opening, access to the files of the FBI and the CIA on all internal and external terrorist activities and information that they had, to have brought down that ship, to turn that meeting into that kind. Now, is that what happened? It's probably as consistent with everything that I know as anything. And I have found that Christopher's story has some of the best connections in the intelligence world of anyone that I know. It's a most terribly regrettable thing, but after all these months, they have not come to a conclusion with respect to what caused that airplane to come down. And I was amazed to find out that Major Myers was not permitted by the FBI to testify to the National Transportation Board until, gosh, it must have been almost 6 months after the incident. Now, we've had another bombing, and most of you, I'm sure, do not know very much about, even know that we had a bombing in Waco. Now, this picture shows the compound as it was being, I dare say, attacked on the day that the whole compound was burned. You can see a tank entering the building here. This towering part of the building is over about a 20-foot by 20-foot reinforced concrete structure that they call the Church Records Vault. And you had a tower above that, three or four floors. And I want you to note this window right here. You have a flagpole, and the line of sight from the TV camera that took the pictures that I'll show you of the explosion was lined up across here, so you can precisely determine the line of sight from the camera back to the fire. And you have tanks in behind, a tank back here that had been driving into the building and collapsing the structures in behind, and this channel across here finally tumbled down, and the walls were pushed in very much around the whole building. And then these two tanks finally pulled away, and just a few minutes after they pulled away, the whole thing was engulfed with flame. It started right here and here and back in here. And with the very high winds, it was consumed fairly quickly. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see the arrow you can see a bright spot, and that is right there. That is the window that I was pointing out to you, and you can even see the cross piece in there, because when that demolition charge went off in that building, the walls really provided tamping, and the force that they exert back on the expanding gases is very high, because the pressure is moving so fast and the pressure is so high. It's like hitting a baseball with a bat. The faster you hit the ball, the greater the pressure on it, and the same thing is true in the tamping effect of a building surrounding detonation products. And the second frame shows it blasting through the window. The second frame shows it getting over to the corner, and the building comes apart, and you can see in all those pictures there the distortions and perturbations and the expansion of that gas cloud are caused by the dynamic flow of the gaseous products around the building components as it is blown up. And you can see here the further expansion of the fireball, and it starts to lift down here in this particular area. But that was a detonation of a demolition charge in the building. Now, if you look at the top, after the fire, you look at the top, and there is a hole, probably 2 feet across, and that's the kind of hole you get with a demolition charge. You have concrete in contact or close proximity to high explosives, and the pressure is several hundred times the yield strength of the concrete, so the concrete in the area of the